The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of the precinct, casting long, jagged shadows across the cluttered desks. The air buzzed with the usual symphony of chaos phones shrilling incessantly, the low hum of an overworked printer, and the overlapping voices of officers barking orders or trading half-hearted jokes. I sat hunched over my keyboard, the lukewarm coffee in my mug growing colder with every reluctant sip. My fingers danced across the keys, chasing the tail end of a report from the night shift, a mundane task that felt like wading through molasses. Everything about the day seemed to hum along on autopilot, a predictable rhythm I'd grown numb to over the years. Nothing hinted at the storm brewing just beyond the horizon of that ordinary moment. Nothing, at least until I glanced up and saw him. Officer Thomas Riley stood near the precinct's entrance, his broad frame leaning casually against the doorframe as if he owned the place. His lips curled into a crooked, self-assured grin, the kind that made my stomach twist with unease. Riley wasn't just confident, was cocky, a man who wore his badge like a crown and wielded his authority like a blunt weapon. I'd seen that look in his eyes before, a glint of something dark and unchecked, as though he believed the world bent to his will simply because he demanded it. It wasn't the quiet strength of a leader, it was the swagger of a bully. The kind who thrived on putting others in their place, especially those he deemed unworthy of his respect. My fingers paused over the keyboard, the unfinished sentence on my screen forgotten as I watched him scan the room. With that predatory gaze, for a fleeting moment, his eyes locked with mine, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Was that flicker of malice meant for me, or was it just the overflow of his usual arrogance? I couldn't tell, but it left a bitter taste in my mouth all the same. Then she walked in. The air seemed to shift the moment her polished shoes crossed the threshold, as if the room itself recognized something extraordinary had arrived. She was a black woman, her navy blue suit tailored to perfection, the crisp lines accentuating her poised, unyielding posture. Her stride was deliberate, each step resonating with purpose, and her presence carried a weight that silenced the chatter around me without a single word. In one hand, she clutched a sleek leather briefcase, its surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. In the other, she bore an expression of steel calm, resolute, and utterly unshakable. Her dark eyes swept the room, taking in every detail with the precision of someone who'd fought her way to this moment. Through sheer will, there was no hesitation in her, no trace of doubt. She belonged here, and she knew it, even if others didn't yet. Riley noticed her too, and I could almost see the gears turning in his head as he sized her up. He pushed off the doorframe, sauntering toward her with that same infuriating smirk plastered across his face. "Hey, you lost," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. He planted himself squarely in her path, arms crossed over his chest like a gatekeeper challenging an intruder. The words hung in the air, sharp and mocking, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Around me, the precinct seemed to hold its collective breath, the tension coiling tighter with every second. Riley's tone wasn't just Ruddite, it was a deliberate jab, a power play wrapped in casual cruelty. My hands curled into fists beneath my desk, the anger simmering low in my gut. I'd seen Riley pull stunts like this before, but this time, something about it felt uglier, more personal. She didn't flinch. Not even a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face as she met his gaze head-on, her eyes locking with his in a way that made the room feel smaller, more suffocating. "No," she replied, her voice smooth and steady, cutting through the haze of his mockery like a blade. "I'm here for a meeting." The simplicity of her response only seemed to fuel Riley's arrogance. He raised an eyebrow, giving her a slow, exaggerated once-over, his lips twitching as if he were barely holding back a laugh. "Meeting," he echoed, his tone thick with disbelief. "Lady, this is a police station. You sure you're not looking for the community center down the street?" The words landed like a slap, cold and biting, and I felt the temperature in the room plummet. A few officers nearby shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Riley and the woman. But no one spoke up. I wanted to, but my tongue felt heavy, glued to the roof of my mouth by years of watching this kind of nonsense play out in silence. Her composure didn't waver. She didn't snap back or shrink under the weight of his scorn. Instead, she stood taller, her calm radiating a quiet power that made Riley's bravado look cheap by comparison. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said, her words measured but firm, each syllable carrying the weight of someone who'd faced worse than this and come out stronger. Riley chuckled, a low, grating sound that oozed sarcasm. "Right?" he drawled, leaning in slightly as if to test her resolve. "So what's this meeting about? Huh? Delivering lunch? Filing a complaint? Or maybe you're here to sell something?" His voice was a taunt, a dare, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. The sheer disrespect in his tone made my blood boil, and I gripped the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to leap up, to shove him back and tell him to shut his mouth, but I hesitated, pinned by the fear of crossing that invisible line. She didn't need me to fight her battles. Adjusting her briefcase with a subtle flick of her wrist, she met his sneer with a level gaze. "I'm here for business," she said simply, her tone unshaken, a stark contrast to the venom in his words. Riley snorted, his mockery growing bolder. "Business," he repeated, his voice rising with exaggerated incredulity. "Well, in that case, the kitchen's around back. You can use the service door." That was its breaking point. My anger flared hot and wild, and I half rose from my chair, ready to intervene. But before I could take a step, she did something that stopped me cold. She tilted her head ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to pierce through his bravado. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice still steady, but laced with an undercurrent of authority that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Riley faltered, caught off guard by the question. He smirked, but it was weaker now, less certain. "Why, you gonna report me?" He shot back, trying to reclaim his footing. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she offered him a polite, almost serene smilione that hid something deeper, something knowing. "Thank you, Officer Riley," she said softly, her words carrying a quiet menace that sent a ripple through the room. "I'll be sure to remember that." His grin slipped, just for a heartbeat, and I saw the first crack in his armor. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could spit out another word, the scene shifted in a way none of us could have predicted. A young Officer Tyler Johnson, barely a year on the force game, barreling down the hallway, his boots squeaking against the linoleum. His face was a mask of panic, his cheeks flushed as he skidded to a stop in front of her. For a moment, he seemed to wrestle with himself, his wide eyes darting between her and Riley. Then, with a shaky breath, he snapped to attention and saluted her sharply. "Chief Walker," he said, his voice trembling but clear. The room went still, the air thick with the weight of those two words. Riley's face drained of color, his swagger evaporating as if someone had pulled a plug. He stumbled back a step, his mouth working soundlessly like a fish gasping for air. "Chief Walker?" He stammered, the words barely audible, a pitiful echo of his earlier bravado. "That's right," Johnson said, his tone firming up now as he glanced at Riley with a mix of pity and disdain. "She's our new precinct chief." The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy, electric thing that pressed down on us all. Riley stood frozen, his hands twitching at his sides, his once proud posture crumbling into something small and fragile. Chief Walker didn't let the moment linger. She raised a hand, silencing the room with the slightest gesture. "Officer Riley," she said, her voice calm but laced with an authority that brooked no argument. "Why don't we step into my office? I think we need to talk." It wasn't a request, it was a command, delivered with the grace of someone who knew the power she held and wielded it without malice. Riley nodded mutely, his head dipping as he followed her down the hall. His steps were halting, uncertain, a stark contrast to the strut he'd worn like a second skin just minutes before. I watched them disappear around the corner, my heart still pounding in my chest. Whatever happened behind that closed door, I didn't know, not yet. But when Riley emerged an hour later, he was a shadow of the man he'd been. His shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor, and that insufferable swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt almost reverent. He shuffled back to his desk, head bowed, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction curl in my chest. Whatever Chief Walker had said, whatever she'd done, it had stripped him bare, leaving behind a man forced to reckon with the consequences of his own arrogance. The precinct felt different that afternoon, the air charged with a strange, expectant energy. I replayed the scene in my mind, each detail sharper than the last release smirk as he mocked her, the unshakable calm in her eyes, and the moment her title dropped like a thunderclap, shattering his world. She wasn't just some stranger passing through, she was Chief Walker, the first black woman to command this precinct, a trailblazer who'd clawed her way through a system rigged against her. Her reputation preceded her years of grit, of breaking ceilings others couldn't even reach, but seeing her in action was something else entirely. It wasn't just about Riley's downfall, though that was a sweet kind of justice. It was about what she represented, a reckoning, a reminder that power misused has a price, and that true strength doesn't need to shout to be heard. Around me, the precinct buzzed with whispers. Officers swapped theories about what had gone down in that office, stunned, some quietly cheering, others still grappling with the shift in the pecking order. Tyler Johnson lingered near the coffee machine, his hands trembling slightly as he poured a cup, his young face alight with a mix of awe and nerves. He'd been the one to name her, to drop the bomb that changed everything, and I could see the weight of that moment settling into him. Meanwhile, Riley sat at his desk, staring blankly at a stack of papers, his silence louder than any apology he could have offered. The lesson was clear, etched into the very walls of the precinct. Justice isn't just a word, it's a force, and when it's wielded by someone like Chief Walker, it can dismantle even the deepest rot. As I watched her silhouette move through the halls later that day, her head high and her stride unbroken, I knew this was only the beginning. The system might be broken, but she was here to fix each own humbled soul at a time. The air in the precinct felt thick, almost suffocating, as if it carried the weight of something unspoken yet deeply understood by everyone who walked its halls. It wasn't just a fleeting unease, it was a persistent, gnawing tension that clung to the faded paint of the locker room walls, hovered over the chipped tables in the break room, and trailed through the narrow corridors like a shadow no one could shake. Chief Walker had arrived, and with her came a seismic shift that rippled through every corner of the building. She'd left her mark, not with loud proclamations or dramatic flair, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve that promised nothing would ever settle back into the old, comfortable chaos. I felt it the moment I stepped into the break room that morning, the nervous hum in the air prickling against my skin like static. The faint clatter of a spoon against a mug drew my eyes to Officer Johnson, who stood hunched over by the coffee machine. His hands trembled as he poured the dark liquid, the steam curling upward in lazy wisps that seemed to mirror the turmoil swirling inside him. His broad shoulders, usually squared with a kind of effortless confidence, slumped slightly, and his fingers fumbled with the creamer, spilling a few drops onto the counter. Was it the shock of what had just unfolded, or something deeper gnawing at him? I couldn't tell, but the sight of him so unsteady, so unlike the man I'd known, sent a shiver of unease through me. Whatever it was, one truth stood stark and undeniable. The precinct had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back. "Hey, Johnson," I said, forcing a lightness into my tone as I crossed the room, my boots scuffing softly against the worn linoleum. He turned his head just enough to acknowledge me, offering a faint nod that felt more like a reflex than a greeting. His eyes, though, betrayed him wide and clouded. They flickered with a restlessness that suggested his mind was still replaying the scene, frame by frame, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice thin and fraying at the edges, as if the words were slipping away before he could grasp them fully. "I didn't know she was the new chief. Heard whispers about her back in training stories from the guys who'd crossed paths with Herbert. I never imagined she'd be the one to his sentence dangled, unfinished." His brows knitting together as he stared into the depths of his coffee. "To what?" I pressed, leaning casually against the counter. Though my pulse quickened with curiosity, I could feel the weight of his hesitation, the way his thoughts churned beneath the surface. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he wrestled with the memory. "To stand up to Riley like that," he finally said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as though speaking it aloud might summon the man himself. "Everyone knows Riley. He's got that edge, you know, always acting like he's untouchable, like the rules don't apply to him." But the way she handled him, he shook his head, a flicker of awe breaking through his unease. It was like she saw right through him before he even had a chance to open his mouth. I nodded slowly, the image of Chief Walker's unflinching stance flashing in my mind. A quiet pang of admiration stirred in my chest, catching me off guard. She didn't even blink. I murmured, my voice softer now, almost reverent. Didn't give him an inch. Didn't let him rattle her. She just stood there, steady as a rock, and it was like the whole room bent to her will. Johnson let out a short, bitter laugh, the sound sharp against the hum of the coffee machine. Riley's not used to that, he said, his lips twisting into a wry half-smile. He's always been the one barking orders, throwing his weight around. But not today, not with her. I couldn't argue with that. There was something different about Chief Walker, something that set her apart from anyone who'd ever walked these halls before her. It wasn't just how she'd put Riley in his placetha that alone was a feat worth noting. It was the way she carried herself, with a quiet authority that didn't need to shout to be heard. Every step she took through the precinct felt deliberate, as if she'd been born to lead this place, as if the walls themselves recognized her right to command. She didn't demand respect, she simply claimed it, and we all felt it, whether we wanted to or not. For a moment, Johnson and I stood there in silence, the weight of our thoughts pressing down on us. The precinct had always been a simmering pot of egos and grudges, but now it felt like the lid had been blown off, leaving us all raw and exposed. I could sense it in the way people moved quicker, quieter, their eyes darting as if waiting for the next shoe to drop. Then came the sharp click of heels against the tile, a sound that cut through the stillness like a blade. The break room door swung open, and I didn't need to turn to know who it was. Chief Walker stepped inside, her presence flooding the space like a tide, steady and inevitable. She didn't acknowledge us right away. Instead, she moved toward the coffee machine with the same measured precision I'd come to associate with. Here a woman who wasted nothing, not a glance, not a breath. Her dark blazer hugged her frame, the fabric crisp and unyielding, and her hair was pulled back in a tight bun that spoke of discipline and focus. As she reached for a mug, her movements were smooth, almost graceful, but there was a strength beneath them, a coiled energy that made the air feel charged. Johnson straightened beside me, his coffee forgotten as he cleared his throat. Chief Walker, he said, his voice steady but laced with a thread of uncertainty, like a man stepping onto thin ice. She turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that was both disarming and reassuring. They were sharp, those ice worm enough to put you at ease, yet piercing enough to strip away any pretense. Officer Johnson, she replied, her tone smooth as polished stone, firm yet not unkind. I trust you've had a productive day. Johnson blinked, caught off guard by the question, and I could see the faint flush creeping up his neck as he scrambled to respond. Yes, Chief, he managed, standing a little taller. I was just talking to Officer Taylor here. She nodded, her gaze flicking to me for a brief, appraising moment before returning to him. Good, she said simply, then paused, letting the word hang in the air. I'd like to have a word with both of you in my office, if you're available. There was no question in her voice, no room for negotiation, just a calm, unshakable directive that tightened my stomach with a mix of anticipation and dread. She didn't wait for a reply. She turned and strode toward the door, expecting us to follow. And we did, because somehow, we both knew this wasn't just a request, it was the start of something bigger, something that would redraw the lines we'd all been walking. The walk to her office felt longer than it should have, each step echoing in the hollow corridor as my mind raced. What must it be like, I wondered, to sit on her side of the desk, to hold the reins of power in a place like this, where every decision rippled out to touch dozens of lives, to have the respect of your officers not because you demanded it, but because you'd earned it through sheer force of will? By the time we reached her door, my curiosity had twisted into something deeper, a yearning to understand the woman who'd already begun to reshape everything I thought I knew about this job. Her office was small, but it exuded order in a way that felt almost sacred. The desk was bare save for a few neatly stacked files, a pen aligned perfectly beside them, and a single framed photo turned away from view. The walls bore no decorations, no plaques or awards, just the faint outline of where someone else's belongings had once hung. She closed the door behind us with a soft click that seemed to seal us in, then took her seat, gesturing for us to do the same. The chairs were stiff, the leather creaking under our weight as we settled across from her. She folded her hands on the desk, her posture impeccable, and fixed us with a steady gaze. "I know you're both new to this precinct," she began, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "And I want to make one thing crystal clear. We are here to do a job. That job demands we work as a team. We hold each other accountable, and we respect each other. That is not up for debate." Her eyes met mine, then Johnson's, and I felt the weight of her words settle into my bones. "I expect nothing less from every officer under my command. I don't care where you've been, what you've done, or what you think you can get away with. Disrespect will not stand, not toward me, not toward each other, not toward the people we serve." The silence that followed was heavy, almost tangible, as if her authority had filled the room and left no space for anything else. I couldn't look away from her, couldn't shake the realization that she wasn't just speaking, she was laying down a foundation, a code we'd all be measured by. She wasn't here to win friends or soothe egos. She was here to build something stronger, something just, and in that moment, I understood. Chief Walker wasn't a title or a figurehead. She was a reckoning, a force that would hold us all to account, whether we liked it or not. The days that followed felt strange, like the precinct had been caught in a quiet storm. Officers moved with a new wariness, their steps softer, their voices hushed as if testing the air. Riley's confrontation with Chief Walker lingered in everyone's minds, a stark reminder of what had changed. He'd always been the loud one, the brash one, swaggering through the halls with a grin that dared anyone to challenge him. But now, he was a ghost of that man, head down, shoulders slumped, his once boisterous laugh replaced by a silence that spoke volumes. I caught sight of him one morning, shuffling past my desk with his eyes fixed on the floor, and I couldn't deny the flicker of satisfaction that warmed my chest. Riley had wielded his badge like a club, bruising anyone who got in his way, and it had tainted us all. Seeing him brought low felt like justice, small but real. Yet Chief Walker didn't revel in his downfall. She didn't need to. She'd made her point with a single, unflinching stand. Actions had consequences, and no one was above them. That was the lesson she burned into us, not just for Riley, but for everyone. Power, she seemed to say, was a privilege, not a weapon, and abusing it would cost you more than you could afford. It was a truth that sank deep, reshaping the way I saw her, the precinct, and even myself. Later that week, I overheard Johnson talking to Officer Martinez in the hallway, their voices low but urgent. Martinez was older, grizzled, with a perpetual frown etched into his weathered face, a man who'd seen chief scum and go without blinking. "You hear what she's doing?" Johnson asked, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting her to appear. "New trainings in citivy stuff. Conflict resolution. Wants us all on the same page, especially with how we handle civilians." Martinez grunted, crossing his arms, his skepticism plain. "Think it'll stick? This place has been a mess for years." Johnson hesitated, then shrugged. "Maybe. She's not messing around, though. You saw what she did to Riley. She's not here to play." I lingered nearby, pretending to check my phone, but their words stuck with me. Chief Walker wasn't just cleaning house, she was rewriting the rules, demanding we rise to meet them. And as I watched her move through the precinct in the days that followed, her quiet strength a constant presence, I couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Justice wasn't just a word under her watch, it was a promise, one she'd enforce with every fiber of her being. The consequences of power misused had never been clearer, and for the first time, I believed we might actually live up to the badges we wore. The air inside the police station hung heavy with the scent of stale coffee and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. It wasn't a place where anyone walked in expecting a warm embrace or a pat on the back, least of all the officers who called it home. Johnson leaned against the chipped edge of a desk, his broad shoulders slumping as he rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know, man," he muttered, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many long nights. "There's just something about her. She doesn't have to scream or wave a gun in your face. She just is, and somehow that's enough to make you sit up and listen." I shuffled past him, my boots scuffing against the worn linoleum, and gave a quiet nod to myself. He wasn't wrong. Chief Walker had a presence that didn't rely on theatrics or empty charisma. She didn't need to bellow orders or charm anyone into submission. Her authority came from something deeper, something unshakable, and it radiated from her like heat from a furnace. It wasn't loud or flashy, it was steady, undeniable, and far more powerful than any raised voice could ever be. Her arrival at the precinct hadn't just brought new rules, it had sparked a quiet revolution. The policies she rolled out weren't mere checklists to enforce it, they were a deliberate attempt to reshape the very soul of the place. She demanded respect not just for the badge, but for every person who crossed our path, whether they wore a uniform, sat in a cell, or stood trembling on the other side of a call. She'd introduced training sessions that went beyond the usual drills of marksmanship or protocol. These were raw, uncharted lessons in emotional depth, how to read a room, how to keep your cool when the world around you erupted, how to face chaos without letting it swallow you whole. A week later, I found myself stepping into one of those sessions. It wasn't required, but curiosity tugged at me, and I figured it couldn't do any harm. I'd braced myself for something soft, something that might feel out of place in a precinct built on grit, and Steele made a lecture on feelings that would leave me squirming in my seat. But the moment Chief Walker took the floor, those doubts evaporated. She stood at the front of the room, her posture straight but not rigid, her dark eyes scanning us with a clarity that cut through the haze of skepticism. Her voice was crisp, measured, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. She didn't just talk about respect, she dissected it, showed us how to earn it, how to offer it, how it could be a tool sharper than any weapon on our belts. Around me, the room shifted. Officers who'd slumped in their chairs, arms crossed and faces hard, began to lean forward, their eyes narrowing as they listened. I couldn't help but steal a glance at Riley, tucked away in the back corner. His head was bowed, his pen scratching across a notepad in slow, deliberate strokes. He wasn't the Riley I'd known, brash, loudmouth rookie who'd swagger through the halls like he owned them. This version of him was quieter, his usual smirk replaced by a furrowed brow. Was he actually absorbing this? Or was he just biding his time, waiting for the clock to run out? Something in the way he sat, the way his shoulders hunched as he wrote, hinted at a change, a crack in the armor he'd worn so proudly. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see the weight of what Chief Walker was laying out before us. She moved through the session with purpose, her words weaving a lesson that felt both simple and profound. Confrontation doesn't have to end in fists or threats, she said, her gaze steady as it swept the room. This badge, it's not a crown. It doesn't put you above anyone. It's a promissetto, protect, to serve, to step in when others can't. She paused, letting the silence settle, her eyes locking onto each of us in turn. So tell me, what kind of officers do you want to be? The ones who make things worse, or the ones who make them better? The room went still. You could have heard a whisper ripple through the air. For once, the usual grumbles and sit-along glances were absent. These were men and women who'd been forged in the fire of late-night calls and bitter streets, their edges sharpened by years of hard choices. And yet, there they sat, their faces tight with thought, her question echoing in their minds. It wasn't just words, it was a challenge, a mirror held up to reflect who we'd become and who we still could be. For me, it felt like a jolt, a sudden clarity that stripped away the routine I'd buried myself in. This wasn't about the badge anymore. It was about the person wearing it. In the weeks that followed, the precinct began to hum with a different rhythm. Change didn't crash in like a tidal wave, it seeped in, slow and subtle, threading its way through the cracks of our daily grind. Chief Walker wasn't here to play the hero or win a popularity contest. She was here to drag us kicking and screaming if necessary toward something better. She shifted how we spoke to each other, how we sized up a situation, how we carried ourselves in the field. It was uncomfortable, messy, and not everyone was on board. Some clung to the old ways like lifelines, their pride tangled up in the power they'd wielded for years. Riley, for one, had been among them until recently. I'd catch him now and then. His cocky grin dulled, his eyes distant, like he was wrestling with something he couldn't quite name. I remember the day it all started to click for me. It was a Wednesday, unremarkable at first, the precinct buzzing with its usual chaos, phones ringing, boots stumping, voices overlapping in a steady drone. But beneath it all, There was a current, a restless energy that prickled at the back of my neck. As I moved through the halls, snippets of conversation drifted toward me. Some officers were warming to the new approach, their tones lighter as they swapped stories about how the training had steadied their hands. Intense moments. "It's like I can actually think out there now," one of them said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. But not everyone was sold. Near the break room, I caught the low rumble of Officer Harris's voice, thick with irritation. He was a veteran, his face etched with lines from decades of hard calls, his hands perpetually curled into fists as if ready to swing at the world. "She's turning this place upside down," he growled, his words sharp enough to slice through the hum of the station. "What are we supposed to do, hug it out with every punk we haul in? We're here to keep order, not play therapist." His partner, Officer Reed, a weary kid with barely 3 years under his belt, shifted uneasily, his fingers drumming against his coffee mug. "I don't know, Harris," he said, his voice softer, almost hesitant. "Maybe she's onto something. The old way's been breaking more than it's fixing." Harris snorted, his eyes narrowing. "Breaking? It's worked fine since before you were born. You don't just toss that out because some new chief's got a wild hair." I lingered just out of sight, my back pressed to the wall, feeling the tension coil in the air. This wasn't about paperwork or procedure, it was about power, about who got to call the shots and how. Harris and his kind had thrived on the old rules, where strength meant control and control meant everything. Chief Walker's vision threatened that, and they hated her for it. The precinct felt split that day, a fault line running through it, those who were bending toward her light on one side, and those digging their heels into the shadows on the other. The real test came a few days later, when a call crackled over the radio. A domestic dispute, loud and messy, the kind we'd handled 100 times before. But this time, Chief Walker rolled out with us. She didn't sit back in her office, barking orders through a headset. She climbed into the patrol car, her jaw set, her presence a quiet force beside us. When we arrived, the scene was a tangle of raised voices and shattered glass, the air thick with anger. I watched the other officers hesitate, their hands hovering near their belts, waiting for the signal to charge in. But Chief Walker stepped forward, her movements deliberate, her eyes sharp as she took it all in. She approached the woman at the center of it, disheveled, tear-streaked, her voice trembling with fury and fear. Chief Walker didn't bark commands or loom over her. She knelt slightly, bringing herself to eye level, her voice low and steady. "Tell me what happened," she said, and then she listened, really listened as the woman's words spilled out in a jagged rush. There was no judgment in her face, no impatience, just a quiet strength that seemed to anchor the chaos around her. The woman's shoulders eased, her breath slowing, as if someone had finally seen her, not just her problem. Standing there, watching it unfold, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about diffusing a situation, it was about rewriting what it meant to wear the badge. We weren't here to dominate or punish. We were here to understand, to untangle the mess of human lives, to be the steady hand when everything else fell apart. Justice, I realized, wasn't just about locking people away, it was about lifting them up, about consequences that healed instead of broke. As we drove back, I caught Riley lingering by the car, his usual bravado gone. He was talking to another officer, his voice muted, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. I couldn't hear what he said, but the way he stood, head tilted, eyes fixed on the ground, told me he was turning something over in his mind, something heavy. Later that week, we gathered for another training session, this one on conflict resolution. Chief Walker paced the room, guiding us through scenarios with a calm that belied the stakes. "It's not about winning," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the group. "It's about control of yourself, first and foremost." Then Riley spoke up, his voice cracking the silence like a stone through glass. "What do you do when they're coming at you, full-on aggressive?" he asked, his tone raw, unguarded. "How do you not just react?" She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You choose," she said finally. "You meet their fire with yours, or you step back and let calm take over." The power's in knowing the difference. The room held its breath, and I saw Riley's jaw tighten, his eyes flickering with something new doubt, maybe, or the first faint spark of understanding. Chief Walker's lessons weren't just about rules or tactics, they were about consequences, about the ripple effects of every choice we made. She showed us that power unchecked could rot us from the inside. That true strength lay in restraint, in compassion, in the courage to do right even when it was hard. And as the days stretched on, I saw that truth take root not just in me, but in Riley, in Harris, in all of you, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. The air in the precinct had grown thick with unspoken tension over the years, a weight I hadn't fully noticed until it began to lift. It wasn't Riley who had been the root of it all, not anymore. He'd been a symptom, a loud echo of something uglier, something that had taken root long before any of us had badges pinned to our chests. The real problem was the culture we'd inherited, a tangle of outdated beliefs that power meant barking orders and throwing your weight around. That way of thinking had been a cornerstone once, but now it was crumbling, piece by piece, and not just because of one person's efforts. It was all of use, every officer, every choice we made, slowly chipping away at it, day by day. We were learning to rise above what we'd been, to reshape ourselves into something better. Justice wasn't about who could yell the loudest anymore. It was about what we did when no one was watching. The precinct had found a new pulse, a quieter rhythm that hummed beneath the surface. Gone were the days of chest-pounding power plays. In their place was a steady current of accountability. Chief Walker was at the heart of it, though she didn't lead with thunderous commands or sweeping declarations. Her strength was subtler, woven into the way she carried herself, calm, unshakable. A lighthouse in a storm. You could see her influence rippling outward in the smallest details. The way officers nodded to each other in the halls, their voices softer, their steps less hurried. Even the air felt different, lighter somehow, as if her presence alone reminded us that the old habits wouldn't hold water anymore. She didn't need to loom over us, she simply was, and that was enough to keep us tethered to this new path. But change like that doesn't come without friction, and just when I thought we'd turned a corner, the world threw us a curveball that would test every lesson we'd fought to learn. It started with a call that barely registered on my radaroni of those bleary-eyed, early morning reports you stumble through on autopilot. A shoplifting incident at a corner store, nothing to write home about. The city was no stranger to petty theft. It was just another thread in the tapestry of our daily grind. I figured we'd roll up, sort it out, and be back at the precinct before the coffee went cold. But the moment we stepped into that cramped little shop, the scene hit me like a jolt of static. The suspect was a kid barely old enough to shave, let alone carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was pinned to the linoleum floor, the store manager's knee digging into his back, the man's voice booming with righteous fury. "Stay still, you little punk," he bellowed, his face flushed red with indignation. The teenager writhed beneath him, his breaths coming in sharp, panic gasps, his eyes wide with terror. "Please, let me go. I didn't do anything," he cried, his voice cracking under the strain. It was raw, desperate, the sound of someone drowning in fear. Officer Harris stood a few feet away, hands planted firmly on his hips, his posture radiating impatience. I knew that look. He was itching to step in, to flex his authority and shut this down the old-fashioned way. My stomach tightened, a familiar dread creeping up my spine. This wasn't just about a snatched candy bar or a cheap pair of headphones anymore. The air crackled with something heavier, something that could spiral out of control in a heartbeat. I could feel the crossroads looming. Would we double down on force, or would we pull back and rethink what we were really there to do? Chief Walker had tagged along on this call, as she often did when the stakes felt uncertain. She moved beside me, her eyes scanning the chaos with a quiet intensity that belied her calm exterior. She didn't charge in, didn't bark orders or draw her weapon. Instead, she stood there, taking it all in the manager's tirade, the kid's trembling pleas, Harris's coiled readiness. Her stillness was a stark contrast to the storm brewing around us. The manager kept shouting, his voice a jagged edge slicing through the room, while Harris reached for the kid's arm, yanking him upward with a grunt. The teenager flinched, his body tensing like a cornered animal, ready to lash out or bolt. His fear was a living thing, pulsing in the space between us, and for a moment, I couldn't blame him for wanting to run. Who wouldn't, caught in a vice like that? Then Chief Walker's voice cut through the noise, steady as a heartbeat. "Officer Harris," she said. Not loud, but with a firmness that stopped him cold. "Step back." Harris froze, his brow furrowing in confusion, maybe even a flicker of defiance. He didn't like her, some would say. This woman who'd come in and turned his world upside down. But he respected her enough to obey, albeit with a scowl that said he'd rather be anywhere else. He released the kid's arm and took a grudging step back, his jaw tight. Chief Walker didn't flinch under his glare. "Let me talk to him," she said. Her eyes locked on the teenager, who was still sprawled on the floor, chest heaving, sweat beading on his forehead. She approached him slowly, each step measured, deliberate, like she was crossing a tightrope. "Hey," she said, her voice softening into something almost maternal, a balm against the chaos. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to understand what happened." The shift was immediate, a ripple of calm spreading through the room. The kid stopped thrashing, his wide, fearful eyes meeting hers. For a long moment, he didn't speak, just stared, searching her face for a trap, a lie. His breath slowed, though his hands still trembled. "I didn't steal anything," he whispered. So quiet I almost missed it. "I swear I didn't do it." Chief Walker nodded, not rushing him, giving him room to gather himself. "Let's figure this out," she said gently. "Can you tell me what happened?" I watched the kid's mind churn, his shoulders still hunched, his fingers digging into the floor. But he wasn't fighting anymore, he was listening. For the first time, he seemed to realize he might actually be heard. The store manager, who'd been simmering in the background, finally exploded again. "He's lying," he spat, jabbing a finger at the teenager. "He came in, grabbed stuff, and bolted. I've got him on camera, witnesses too." His voice was thick with accusation, his certainty unshakable. Chief Walker didn't snap back or dismiss him. She just turned and asked, "Can we see the footage?" The manager hesitated, thrown off by her composure, then fumbled for his phone. He thrust it toward us, the screen displaying a grainy, shaky video. It showed a figure darting out the door. Maybe the kid, maybe not. The quality was too poor to tell much beyond that. Chief Walker studied it, then looked back at the teenager. "You're saying you didn't steal anything. Why'd you run?" His voice broke as he answered. "I didn't want to get caught for something I didn't do. I was scar-ready, just I ran." His words hung there, fragile and heavy, a confession of fear more than guilt. The room fell silent, the weight of his truth pressing down on all of us. Harris shifted uncomfortably, his arms crossed, his biases wrestling with what he'd just heard. The manager glowered, clinging to his story. But Chief Walker saw beyond it, beyond the accusations, beyond the surface. She wasn't just policing a crime, she was unpicking a moment, searching for the humanity tangled up in it. After a long pause, she made her call. She turned to the manager, her tone firm but fair. "This is a misunderstanding. We'll take his statement and let him go for now. If you want to push this, we'll review the evidence properly. But I'm not letting you treat him like a criminal just because he was scared." The manager's face twisted with frustration, but he didn't argue. With a final, venomous glance at the kid, he stormed off, muttering under his breath. Chief Walker crouched beside the teenager, her voice softening again. "You're free to go. But if you're ever in trouble, don't run. Talk to us, we'll help. Running only makes it worse." He nodded, relief washing over him, though his eyes still flickered with uncertainty. For him, this was uncharted territory, being treated like a person, not a threat. As we walked out of that store, the weight of it all settled over me. Chief Walker hadn't just diffused a powder keg, she'd rewritten the script. She'd looked past the anger, the fear, the noise, and found a way to bring peace where chaos had reigned. I glanced at Harris, who trudged along in silence, his shoulders slumped. He didn't like how it had played out, didn't like losing the chance to take control. But deep down, I think he knew she'd done it right. This was what we were supposed to be, not enforcers of power, but guardians of fairness. It was a lesson in justice I hadn't realized I'd been starving for. A reminder that abusing authority only deepened the wounds we were meant to heal. The days that followed carried a different energy. It wasn't a loud, flashy change. You couldn't pin it down in a single moment. But it was there, in the way Chief Walker was quietly dismantling the precinct's old foundations and building something new. Thought by thought, action by action, She was molding us into something better. Not everyone was on board. Some clung to the past like a lifeline, but enough of us were shifting to make it matter. It wasn't easy, though. I remember a morning a week later, the precinct buzzing with a flurry of calls that wouldn't let up. The chaos was familiar, but the undercurrent was different, charged with the new dynamics Chief Walker had set in motion. I was passing the break room when I spotted Officer Johnson slumped at the table, his hands cradling a chipped coffee mug. He looked worn, not just from the long shift, but from something deeper. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a quiet that didn't suit him. "Hey, Johnson," I said, sliding into the chair across from him. "You holding up?" He offered a faint, tired smile, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his cup. He didn't answer right away, just sipped his coffee, letting the silence stretch. "It's a lot," he said finally, his voice low, like he was testing the words. "All this change. I don't know what to make of it some days." I nodded, sensing the way he carried grief for the old ways, maybe, or the struggle to find his place in the new ones. We were all feeling it, in our own ways, but Johnson wore it heavier than most. And yet, in that moment, I saw a flicker of something hope, maybe that this shift toward justice, toward consequence over chaos, might just be worth it. The air in the precinct break room felt thick with unspoken tension, as Johnson's voice cut through the hum of distant chatter, low and deliberate, almost like he was testing the weight of his own words. "It's one thing to sit through all those training sessions, tossing around ideas like they're pieces on a game board," he said, his gaze drifting somewhere past the chipped edge of his coffee mug. "But out there, in the real world, it's a different beast entirely. The split-second calls, the chaos of the situations, the way people look at you, some with fear, some with defiance. It's not something you can just prepare for." His fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the mug, betraying the calm he tried to project. I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of doubt, the quiet storm brewing beneath his steady exterior. I nodded, letting his words settle over me like a heavy fog. I knew exactly what he meant. How the pressure to do the right thing wasn't just a burden you carried on your shoulders. It was a shadow that followed you, creeping into every choice, every hesitation. It wasn't abstract anymore. Not out there on the streets where decisions could ripple out and change lives in ways you couldn't undo. And yet, despite the weight, I'd come to see something else, something worth holding onto. Leaning back in my chair, the creak of the old wood punctuating the silence, I met his gaze. "Yeah, it's tough. Nobody's saying it isn't. But what Chief Walker's trying to do, it matters. It's not about turning us into pushovers. It's about making us sharper, better at what we do. She's proving we can uphold the law, keep the peace, without losing ourselves in the process or forgetting why we signed up for this gig in the first place." Johnson didn't answer right away. His eyes dropped to the mug again, his fingers stilling as if my words had caught him off guard. The room buzzed faintly round, us phones ringing in the distance, the clatter of someone rifling through a filing cabinet. But for a moment, it was just the two of us, suspended in this quiet wrestle with what it all meant. When he finally looked up, his stare locked onto mine, searching, maybe even challenging. "I don't know, man," he said, his voice rougher now, edged with something raw. "I get what she's going for, you respect it even. But sometimes I wonder if we're losing the plot. People don't just hand you respect because you ask nicely. You've got to show them you're strong, not just chat them up like they're your buddies." His words lingered, heavy and unresolved, floating between us like smoke you couldn't wave away. I couldn't quite tell if he was genuinely torn or just wrestling with the shift Chief Walker was pushing us toward. His face gave little away, but the way his jaw tightened told me this wasn't just idle talk, it was personal. And he wasn't alone. Plenty of us were grappling with the same thing, not just how we dealt with the people out there, but how we saw ourselves in the mirror at the end of the shift. Were we still the tough, unyielding enforcers we'd been trained to be? Or were we something more now, something harder to define? "I hear you," I said, my voice slow and measured, like I was picking my way through a minefield. "But strength isn't only about flexing muscle or barking orders. It's about control, real control. And that doesn't come from throwing your weight around. It's knowing when to raise your voice and when to shut up and listen, when to step in and when to hold back." He went quiet again, his brow furrowing as he turned my words over in his mind. I didn't expect him to suddenly see the light years of instinct. Don't unravel in a single conversation, but there was a spark in his eyes, a faint glimmer of something shifting. We sat there for a while, the world spinning on around us, the precinct alive with its usual house officers shuffling papers, the crackle of a radio dispatcher's voice, but in that pocket of time, it felt like we were alone. Two men trying to map out what justice looked like in a job that kept rewriting the rules. Later that afternoon, I found myself cruising the streets with Riley, the patrol car humming beneath us as the city stretched out in a blur of concrete and glass. It had been a slow day so far, the kind where the quiet almost lulls you into forgetting how fast things can turn. Riley hadn't said much since that tense standoff with Chief Walker a few days back, and the silence between us felt heavier than usual. I stole a glance at him, his hands tight on the wheel, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He wasn't the same guy I'd known a year ago, all bravado and sharp edges. Now, he seemed smaller somehow, folded in on himself, like the weight of everything had finally started to sink in. I wasn't sure if he was buying into Walker's vision or just drowning in the pushback, but one thing was clear. He was wrestling with something deep, something that went beyond protocol. The radio crackled to life, cutting through the stillness of disturbance at a park a few blocks over. Nothing major, just some teenagers stirring up trouble. But I knew from experience those calls could tip either way. As we pulled up, the scene came into focus. A cluster of kids, maybe 5 or 6 of them, gathered near a weathered picnic table. Their voices carried across the grass, loud and jagged, hands waving in animated gestures. It wasn't a brawl yet, but the air thrummed with the kind of energy that could ignite with one wrong move. Riley stepped out of the car first, his posture stiff, his shoulders squared like he was ready to march in and take command. I could feel old habits clawing their way back, the urge to dominate, to control. He didn't say a word, but I saw the conflict flickering across his face, the tug-of-war between what he'd always done and what Walker wanted us to become. I slid out after him, the gravel crunching under my boots, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Light but firm. "Let me take this one," I said, keeping my voice low, steady. He shot me a look sharp, almost defensive, but he didn't push back. Instead, he stepped aside, his eyes tracking me as I moved toward the group. The teenagers noticed me right away, their chatter faltering as they turned to size me up. I kept my pace slow, my hands loose at my sides, my expression open but calm. "Hey," I called out, my tone even, like I was just another guy checking in. "What's going on here?" For a beat, they didn't respond, their stares hard and wary. Then one of them, an older kid with a faded hoodie and a scowl, stepped forward. His voice clipped but not hostile. "It's nothing serious," he said. "We were just messing around, and somebody got bent out of shape over it. No big deal." His eyes darted to his friends, then back to me, testing the waters. I nodded, letting him know I was listening, really listening. "All right," I said, my voice still soft but clear. "I'm just here to make sure everybody's good. If you all can cool it and head home, we're square. No trouble, no hassle." They exchanged glances, a few muttering under their breath, but slowly. The tension bled out of the air. One by one, they started to drift away, a couple tossing half-hearted apologies over their shoulders. No raised voices, no cuffs, no chouse, just a conversation, a moment of understanding. When I turned back, Riley was still standing there, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. His face was hard to read, surprise, maybe, or something closer to grudging respect. As we walked back to the car, I caught his eye and offered a small smile. "Sometimes strength's not about how loud you can yell," I said. "It's about knowing when to step up and when to let things breathe." He didn't reply right away, but the way he nodded just once, slow and deliberate, told me he was chewing on it, and that was enough for now. By then, I'd seen enough to know change didn't come easy, not in a place like this. The precinct was a battleground of its own old grudges, entrenched ways, a culture that had hardened over decades like concrete. Chief Walker wasn't here to play nice or win popularity contests. She was here to carve out a new path, one where justice didn't mean trading away your humanity, but resistance was baked into the wallsome of it from guys like Riley, still clinging to the old playbook, some of it from the system itself, a machine that didn't like being rewired. She was taking it all on, though, one tough call at a time. That resolve got tested one morning when a call came in about a brawl at a rundown bar on the edge of town. A regular had thrown punches at another patron standard fare on the surface pit when we rolled up. The scene was a powder keg. The crowd spilling out onto the cracked pavement was restless, voices rising in sharp bursts. A few onlookers pacing like they were itching for a fight. The uniformed officers already there looked rattled, their hands hovering near their belts. Uncertainty etched into their stances. I could feel the pull of the old waste instinct to storm in, shut it down, demand order. But then there was Chief Walker, striding through the chaos like a calm in the storm. Her presence steady, unshakable. "Officer Taylor," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise as I approached. Her eyes met mine, sharp but tired, carrying a weight I hadn't noticed before. "Help secure the perimeter. Keep the crowd back while we sort this out." "Got it," I nodded, moving into position, the gravel shifting under my feet as I took in the scene. The other officers hesitated, still adjusting to her command, but there was a thread of trust there, fragile, but growing, binding us together in a way that felt new. As the minutes ticked by, I watched her work the crowd. She didn't bark orders or flex authority. She spoke, low and firm, listening to their grievances, guiding them back from the edge with a quiet force that was all her own. She anticipated every shift, every raised voice, every restless step before it could spiral. But my eyes kept drifting to Riley, posted by the bar's door, his frame rigid, his gaze restless. He wasn't engaging, just standing there, a coiled spring waiting to snap. I wanted to believe he'd taken something from all this, that he'd seen the power in restraint, but the tightness in his stance told me he was still at war with himself, caught between the man he'd been and the one Walker was asking him to become. In that moment, it hit me. This wasn't just about keeping the peace out there. It was about the consequences of power, the cost of wielding it without care. Walker's way wasn't weakness, it was a lesson in accountability, a reminder that justice without control was just another kind of chaos. And as the crowd thinned and the tension eased, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all learning it, one hard step at a time. The air in the dimly lit bar was thick with unspoken tension, a fragile stillness hanging over the crowd like a storm waiting to break. It shattered the moment a tall figure, a man with a scruffy beard and wild, restless eyes decided he'd had enough. His heavy boots scuffed against the worn wooden floor as he bolted toward the door, his broad shoulders shoving through the sea of onlookers. The crowd rippled like water disturbed by a stone, murmurs rising into shouts as the situation teetered on the edge of chaos. Riley, standing near me with his usual restless energy, didn't hesitate. His hand shot out instinctively, fingers clamping around the man's arm with a grip born of reflex rather than thought. With a sharp tug, he spun the fugitive around, his voice erupting in a fierce, rising bark. "Hey, you're not going anywhere." The man's face twisted with defiance, his jaw tightening as he yanked himself free from Riley's hold. He wasn't in the mood for restraint, his whole body screamed it. In a flash, his fist swung through the air, a clumsy but forceful arc that landed square against Riley's jaw with a sickening thud. Riley staggered back, shock flashing across his features as the bar exploded into pandemonium. The crowd surged, a tangle of shoving bodies and raised voices, the air buzzing with the raw electricity of unleashed aggression. I stood frozen for a heartbeat, my pulse hammering in my ears, watching as Riley hit the ground hard, the bearded man looming over him like a predator sizing up its prey. Fists raised, the man's stance promised more violence, and for a fleeting moment, I was certain we were barreling toward something brutal, something irreversible. Around us, the scene dissolved into a blur of motion and noise, glasses clinking as they toppled, chairs scraping against the floor, shouts overlapping into a deafening roar. My chest tightened, adrenaline flooding my veins until every nerve felt alive and raw. This wasn't just another scuffle to break up, another routine call to chalk up on the log. No, this was something heavier, a crucible testing everything Chief Walker had drilled into us over months of sweat and scrutiny. I could almost hear her voice in my head, steady and unyielding, urging us to rise above the chaos. And then, as if summoned by that thought, she was there, Keith Walker, cutting through the madness like a blade through fog. Her presence alone was a force, but it was her voice that truly commanded the room. "Enough," she bellowed, the word sharp and firm, yet laced with a calm that seemed to ripple outward, stilling the crowd as if she'd flipped a switch. No raised hands, no drawn weapon, just the sheer weight of her authority, radiating from her steady gaze and squared shoulders. The bearded man froze mid-step, his fists still clenched, but his momentum halted, as though her words had reached inside him and snagged something primal. The onlookers, too, fell silent, their restless energy snuffed out by the quiet power she wielded. I watched, breath caught in my throat, as she nodded toward the man towering over Riley. "Get him up," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for debate. "We're not here to fight. We're here to resolve this, understand?" The man hesitated, his wild eyes darting between Chief Walker and Riley, who was still sprawled on the floor, dazed and clutching his jaw. For a moment, I thought he might lash out again, defiance flaring in his tense frame. But then, slowly, he nodded a grudging acknowledgement of the unshakable figure before him. Riley pulled himself up, wincing as he rose, his pride bruised as much as his face. I could see the storm brewing in his ice anger, frustration, the urge to strike back, but something held him in check. He stood there, fists balled at his sides, his breathing slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the hot-headed rookie I'd known just weeks ago. Chief Walker didn't need to say another word. With a subtle tilt of her head, she signaled us to take over, and just like that, the fight dissolved before it could truly ignite. The crowd dispersed as quietly as leaves scattered by a breeze, each person drifting back to their own corner of the night. A wave of relief washed over me, loosening the knot in my chest. What could have been a bloody brawl had ended without a single blow exchanged beyond that first punch. But it wasn't just about stopping a fight, it was a lesson, carved deep into the moment. Chief Walker had shown us that justice didn't always demand force, that power unchecked could spiral into ruin, while restraint could build something stronger. As we climbed back into the patrol car, Riley stood beside me, rubbing his sore jaw in silence. I stole a glance at him, catching the flicker of realization in his eyes. He didn't speak, but I could sense the way Chief Walker's calm had pierced through his armor, planting a seed of understanding he couldn't yet voice. The drive back to the precinct was quiet, the usual tension between us softened by an unspoken shift. Riley wasn't transformed overnight into some model officer. The old fire still simmered beneath his surface, ready to flare at the slightest spark. But in that bar, he'd glimpsed another path, strength not in fists or fury, but in knowing when to hold back. Staring out the window, his profile etched against the passing streetlights, he looked different, less like the brash recruit who'd swaggered in weeks ago, more like a man wrestling with lessons he hadn't expected to learn. I wanted to believe this was a turning point, that the worst of our trials were behind us. Yet, as the precinct loomed ahead, a quiet unease gnawed at me. Something bigger was brewing, a storm gathering strength beyond the routine calls and arrests. Chief Walker had been relentless lately, pushing us to our limits, forcing us to rethink our roles in ways that left us raw and exposed. The strain was palpable, not just in me, but in the others too. Veteran officers, their faces lined with years of service, were starting to crack under her quiet intensity, their grumbled complaints echoing in the locker room. Riley, though, was the clearest mirror of her impact. The old habit's quick temper, the itch for control still lingered, flickering in his sharp glances and restless posture. Maybe it was instinct, honed by years of surviving on bravado. Maybe it was the only way he'd ever known to face the world. Whatever it was, he was fighting her influence, even as it reshaped him. That tension came crashing to a head one humid afternoon, when a call crackled through the radio, a domestic disturbance. Routine on paper, but anything but when we arrived. The house sat squat and weathered on a patchy lawn, cars strewn haphazardly across the yard like discarded toys. Shouts spilled from the open windows, sharp and jagged, mingling with the distant hum of cicadas. The air thrummed with danger, thick and oppressive, as we stepped onto the property. Inside, a woman in her late 30s greeted us, her face flushed and streaked with tears. her voice tumbling out in frantic bursts. Behind her, a man paced like a caged animal, his movements jerky, his eyes bloodshot and wild. She stammered that her husband had been drinking, that his temper had erupted into violence, and I could feel the situation spiraling before we'd even crossed the threshold. Chief Walker took the lead, as she always did, stepping forward with a presence that seemed to steady the trembling woman instantly. But the man caught wind of us, storming across the room with a snarl, slamming the door wide open with a force that rattled the frame. "What do you want?" he roared, his voice dripping with venom, his fists already clenched as if daring us to step closer. "Sir, I need you to step back," Chief Walker replied, her tone firm yet measured, a lifeline thrown into the chaos. "We're here to help." But he wasn't listening. He lurched forward, shoving the door wider, his body coiled with aggression. My gut twisted. This could turn ugly fast, and for the first time in a while, I wasn't sure how it would end. Behind me, Riley shifted into position, his hand hovering over his weapon, his jaw set tight. I shot him a glance, but his eyes were locked on the man, burning with that old readiness to leap into action. "Chief," I murmured, edging closer. "He's not going to back down." She nodded faintly, her gaze never wavering. "Just give him space," she said, her voice a steady anchor. "Let him make the next move." Time seemed to stretch, the room a taut wire ready to snap. The man's eyes blazed with desperation, Riley's fingers twitched with restraint, and I stood caught between them, my heart pounding against my ribs. Then he lunged, his hand darting toward a cluttered table nearby, my breath hitched, weapon or not. The intent was clear and my fingers brushed my taser. But Chief Walker's voice sliced through the haze. "Stop," she commanded, sharp and unyielding yet impossibly calm. "Put your hands up now." The man faltered, caught in the gravity of her words, his wild energy snared by her unshakable resolve. Slowly, his hands dropped, trembling with unspent rage, and he stepped back, defeated not by force but by something deeper. The room fell silent, save for his ragged breaths, as Chief Walker closed the gap. Her hand extended in a quiet offer of peace. "We're going to get you help," she said softly. "But this ends now. No one else gets hurt." And just like that, the storm broke. No cuffs, no struggle, just a resolution carved from compassion and control. As we left, I couldn't shake the weight of it. Justice wasn't a gavel or a gun, but a choice in the consequences of power, wielded or withheld, rippled far beyond the moment. The late morning sun beat down on the cracked pavement as Riley and I stepped out of the house, the air thick with the lingering echoes of what had just unfolded inside. The scene we'd left behind, a heated argument diffused, a potential brawl averted, still pulsed in my chest like a second heartbeat. Beside me, Riley walked with his head slightly bowed, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his boots scuffing the ground in a rhythm that matched the churn of his thoughts. He didn't say a word, but the silence wasn't the usual brooding kind I'd grown accustomed to in our early days as partners. This time, it carried a weight, a texture, something introspective, almost fragile, like a man peering into a mirror he wasn't sure he wanted to face. I glanced at him as we approached our patrol cars, their dusty hoods glinting under the sunlight. "You did good back there," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness like a pebble dropped into a pond. He didn't turn to meet my gaze, didn't need to. His jaw tightened briefly, and I caught the faintest shift in his posture, a softening, a release of something he'd been holding onto for too long. It wasn't much, just a flicker, but it was enough to tell me that the Riley I'd first met, one who wore tension like a second skin, who seemed driven by an unspoken need to prove himself at every turn, was starting to unravel. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to see the value in the approach Chief Walker had been drilling into us. That strength didn't always mean raised fists or barked commands. That justice could wear a quieter face. The weeks that followed blurred into a hazy stretch of long shifts and quiet reflection. The chaos of the precinct never truly subsided. Sirens still wailed, radios crackled with urgency, and the coffee pot still churned out its bitter sludge. But beneath it all, something was shifting. It wasn't just the rhythm of our days that felt different, it was the way we moved through them. Riley wasn't the same man I'd partnered with a year ago. The one who'd swaggered through calls with a bravado that felt more like armor than confidence. Now, when we responded to a disturbance or faced down a belligerent suspect, I saw it in his eyes, a steadiness, a patience that hadn't been there before. Even the way he carried himself around the team had changed, less posturing, more presence. It was as if he'd shed a layer of himself, revealing a humbler version beneath. But change, as Chief Walker had warned us, wasn't a straight line. Her vision a precinct guided by restraint, accountability, and respect still rubbed some of the old-timers the wrong way. I'd catch their sit-along glances during briefings, their muttered gripes over lukewarm coffee in the break room. They were men and women forged in a different era, where power was measured in the weight of a baton or the sharpness of a shout. To them, Walker's way felt like a gamble, a softening of the edges they'd spent decades sharpening. And there were days when even I felt the strain, moments when the air grew taut, when we all tiptoed around each other, unsure of where the new boundaries lay. Yet Walker never wavered. She had this unshakable calm, a way of locking eyes with you that made it clear you were either part of this shift or you were in the way. One afternoon, that tension crystallized in the break room, a cramped space with peeling paint and a table scarred by years of spilled coffee and idle knife carvings. Riley and I were leaning against the counter, nursing mugs of the precinct's infamously bad brew, when Officer Harris strode in. His face was a storm cloud, all hard lines and furrowed brows, his broad shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of every call he'd ever answered. He gripped his chipped mug like it was the only thing tethering him to the ground, muttering as he sank into a chair, "This coffee gets worse every damn day." It wasn't an invitation to talk. Not really. But the air crackled with something unspoken, a precipice we could either step back from or tumble over. Riley tilted his head, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "You're not wrong about that," he said, his tone light but laced with an edge of curiosity. Harris let out a bark of a laugh, dry and sharp, his gray eyes flicking between us. When did we start caring about the coffee instead of the job? For a heartbeat, I braced myself. Harris had a reputation, gruff, unyielding, a relic of the precinct's rougher days. I half expected him to launch into one of his tirades about Walker, about how her soft tactics were dragging us all down. But then he surprised me. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and sighed a sound that carried years of exhaustion and something softer, something uncertain. "I don't know, Taylor," he said, his voice dropping low. "I've been thinking about all how things have been running lately." His fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the table, his gaze drifting to the wall as if searching for answers in the faded paint. "I'm not sure where it's all headed, but maybe it's time we gave it a real chance." Riley didn't respond right away. He stared into his coffee, the steam curling up in lazy wisps, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. He wasn't one for grand confessions, never had been, but Harris's words seemed to strike a chord. "I think it's working," Riley said finally, so quiet it was almost a whisper, like he was testing the thought aloud. "At least, I hope it is." For all of us, the silence that settled over us wasn't heavy or awkward. It felt like a bridge, a fragile but real connection forming between three people who'd spent too long on opposite sides of an invisible line. Harris didn't nod or agree outright, but the way his shoulders eased, the way his grip on his mug loosened, told me he was listening, really listening for the first time. That moment lingered with me as we shuffled out of the break room, the faint hum of the precinct buzzing around us. It wasn't a loud revelation, no triumphant horn blaring to mark the occasion, but it was there, a subtle shift, a crack in the wall that had separated the old guard from the new. I realized then that this wasn't just about Riley finding his footing, or Harris softening his edges. It was about all of us, about the way we were starting to see our badges not as weapons, but as tools for something greater. Later that day, Chief Walker summoned us to the briefing room. The space was packed, every officer on shift crammed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the scent of sweat and stale coffee. Walker stood at the front, her posture straight but not rigid, her dark eyes sweeping over us with a quiet intensity. "I know things haven't been easy," she began, her voice cutting through the low murmur like a blade through silk, "but I've seen progress. You've all been working hard to adapt to this new way of doing things, and I'm grateful for that." She paused, letting the words settle, then leaned forward slightly, her tone sharpening. "But I'm also going to challenge you. Always will." There was no pomp, no flourish, just the raw, unvarnished truth of what she expected. More accountability, more respect, more effort. It wasn't an order barked from on high. It was a call, a plea wrapped in steel, urging us to rise to the occasion. "You have the power to make this precinct what you want it to be," she went on, her voice steady as bedrock. "But it starts with you, with how you treat each other, how you show up every day. We've made strides, and I'm proud of that, but it's up to you to carry it forward." I glanced at Riley beside me, his face etched with focus, nodding almost imperceptibly as if her words were sinking deep into his bones. Harris stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable except for that faint flicker in his eyes, a spark of recognition that hadn't been there before. As we filed out, the room felt lighter, not with some grand victory, but with a quiet resolve. We weren't perfect. Her stance lingered, old habits flared, but we were moving, inch by inch, toward something better. That sense of momentum carried into the next morning, when the precinct hummed with a restless energy I couldn't quite place. The call came just before noon, a robbery at a convenience store a few blocks away. Routine. Or so I thought, until I pulled up and saw the chaos spilling out of the cramped storefront. Customers darted from the entrance, their faces pale with panic, while inside, a tall man with a jagged scar across his cheek loomed over the counter. His voice was a guttural snarl as he waved a pistol at the cashier, a young woman, whose hands trembled as she fumbled with the register. The air felt charged, brittle, like a storm about to break. I stepped closer, my pulse thudding in my ears, when Chief Walker appeared beside me. Her stride was measured, her face a mask of calm as she took in the scene, the scattered candy wrappers on the floor, the overturned display of cheap sunglasses, the wild desperation in the suspect's eyes. "Stay alert," she murmured, her voice low, and even as she brushed past me, "We're going to de-escalate this," that word again her North Star, her shield against the violence that simmered just beneath the surface. And despite the gun, despite the fear clawing at my gut, I believed her. Because if there was one lesson Walker had burned into us, it was this: true power didn't come from force or fear, but from the courage to stand steady when everything else was falling apart. Justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a choice, a fragile balance that could tip toward ruin if wielded recklessly. And as I watched her step forward, I knew we were all learning to carry that weight, one careful step at a time. The night was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel heavy. Downtown's old brick buildings loomed silently, their worn facades catching the frantic dance of red and blue lights. Sirens wailed, slicing through the air like a jagged blade, reverberating off the walls and mingling with the murmurs of a growing crowd. Somewhere in the chaos, a voice cried out a desperate, trembling plea for help that tugged at the edges of everyone's nerves. Amid it all, Jackson Cole, a seasoned paramedic with steady hands and a heart that refused to falter, knelt on the cracked pavement beside a young boy. The child lay sprawled, his small frame fragile against the cold ground, his crumpled bicycle a twisted heap a few feet away. Pale as a ghost, the boy's shallow breaths came in uneven gasps, each one a quiet battle to hold on. Jackson's fingers moved with the precision of someone who'd seen too many emergencies, gently probing for broken bones, his palms pressing carefully to stabilize the boy's neck. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the noise as he called out to a nearby bystander, "Someone get his parents on the phone now." There was no room for panic in his tone, only the quiet authority of a man who knew every second mattered. Before anyone could respond, a sharp voice pierced the scene, commanding attention like a whip crack. "What's going on here?" Jackson glanced up for just a heartbeat, his focus flickering. Officer Rick Daniels had arrived, his police cruiser skidding to a halt with a screech that grated against the night. The cop stood tall, his square jaw clenched tight, pale blue eyes sweeping over the chaos with a cold, suspicious glint. Jackson didn't hesitate, his hands still working as he answered, "Bike accident. Kid's hurt but Dean keeping him stable until the ambulance gets here." His words were clipped, efficient, his attention already sliding back to the boy. But Daniels didn't move closer to help. Instead, his gaze settled on Jackson, narrowing with something darker than curiosity. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his tone edged with a challenge that made no sense in the moment. Jackson blinked, caught off guard for a split second. His Navy paramedic uniform standard issue, patched with the city's insignial, made it obvious. Still, he kept his voice even, refusing to rise to the bait. "I'm the paramedic responding to this. The kid's in rough shape, and I need to focus." Daniels didn't budge. A smirk curled his lips as he crossed his arms over his chest, the gesture slow and deliberate, like he was sizing Jackson up for a fight he'd already decided to win. "Funny," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "I didn't know they let you people do jobs like this." The words landed like a punch, sharp and ugly, and for a fleeting moment, Jackson's hands stilled, his jaw tightened, a flicker of anger sparking deep in his chest. But he forced it down. The boy's life hung in the balance. There was no time to let this man's venom take root. "Sir," he said, his tone steady as steel, "I need you to move. You're blocking access to my gear." Daniels didn't flinch. He stood his ground, towering over Jackson like a shadow that refused to lift. "I'm just making sure everything's above board here," he said, his voice thick with condescension. "You don't exactly look like you belong." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a ripple of unease spreading through the onlookers. Someone muttered, "What's his problem?" under their breath, while another pulled out a phone. The faint click of a recording starting up. Jackson's pulse hammered in his ears, a storm of frustration and disbelief swirling inside him. But he kept his eyes on the boy. He couldn't afford to let this escalate, not now, not when every heartbeat mattered. But Daniels wasn't finished. He crouched down, too close, his breath hot and sour as he leaned in and muttered, "I'll bet you don't even have the proper credentials, do you? Probably just here to showboat." That was it. Jackson's head snapped up, his dark brown eyes locking onto Daniels' icy stare. The air between them crackled, heavy with unspoken fury. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the paramedic fighting to save a life, and the officer determined to wield his authority like a weapon. Jackson's voice, when it came, was low and deliberate, each word carved with precision. "Officer, this boy's life is on the line. Either step aside or help. Otherwise, I suggest you back off." The crowd held its breath, the tension so thick it felt like the night itself might shatter. Daniel's smirk faltered, just for a second, but he didn't move. His eyes flicked over Jackson, searching for a crack, a weakness, anything he could exploit. Finding none, he straightened up slowly, his posture radiating defiance. Across town, in a dimly lit convenience store, bathed in the harsh glow of flickering fluorescence, another scene was unfolding. Goni, that stood in stark contrast to the power play on the pavement. The air inside was stale, tinged with the faint scent of spilled coffee and cheap cleaning supplies. Customers crouched behind aisles, their whispers barely audible over the low hum of the lights. At the center of it all stood a man, his hands trembling as he clutched a gun, its barrel trained on a wide-eyed cashier who looked seconds away from breaking. Sweat beaded on the suspect's forehead, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged bursts. His eyes darted toward the glass door, where shadows moved in the night beyond. He wasn't a hardened criminal, Agnon could see that. He was just a guy, maybe in his late 20s, with a patchy beard and a threadbare jacket, caught in a spiral of desperation he couldn't escape. Fear radiated from him, raw and unfiltered. A man drowning in the consequences of a choice he'd made in a moment of weakness. Outside, the team moved like ghosts, slipping into position around the store's perimeter with practiced silence. I stayed close to Chief Walker, my boots barely making a sound on the asphalt as we edged nearer. She was a figure of quiet strength, her dark hair pulled back tight, her jaw set with a determination that never wavered. I trusted her judgment, her ability to steer us through chaos without letting it spiral into bloodshed. In that moment, with the night pressing in and the stakes climbing higher, that trust felt like a lifeline, the one thing keeping me grounded as the weight of the situation settled over us all. She moved toward the entrance, her steps measured but unafraid, and I followed, my heart thudding in my chest. Inside, the suspect's head jerked up as she stepped into view, her silhouette framed by the glass. "Put the gun down," she said, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade tempered by calm. "You don't want this to get worse. You don't want anyone to get hurt." Her words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that filled the room, soothing yet unyielding. The suspect's shoulders stiffened, his grip on the gun tightening for a fleeting second as he wrestled with himself. I could see it in his iced storm of doubt, the flicker of hope warring with despair. This was a razor's edge, a moment where one wrong breath could tip everything into chaos. I held mine, my fingers brushing the holster at my side, every muscle coiled but still. Chief Walker didn't waver. She took another step, slow and deliberate, her gaze locked on his. "You don't need to do this," she said again, her tone softer now, almost like she was reaching out to pull him back from the brink. "We're not your enemies. You're Scaretti, see that. But this can end without anyone getting hurt. Just put the weapon down." The store fell silent, the hum of the lights the only sound threading through the stillness. The customers huddled in the aisles peeked out, their faces pale masks of fear and fascination. Then something shifted. The man's posture softened, his fingers loosening around the gun's grip, just enough to notice. His eyes, wild and searching, lingered on Chief Walker, and for the first time, he seemed to see Hernet as a uniform, not as a threat, but as someone who understood the weight of his mistakes. "You're not alone in this," she continued, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. "We've all been lost. We've all messed up, but we're here to help you. It starts with you trusting us." And just like that, the air changed. The man's hand trembled harder. But this time, it wasn't from fear, it was surrender. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered the gun, its metal glinting faintly as it descended. His gaze flicked to the door, where the rest of us waited, shadows in the night, and then back to her. When the weapon clattered onto the counter, the sound echoed like a thunderclap, and the entire store seemed to breathe again. Relief washed over the room and Waivist cashier's shoulders sagged. The customers exhaled shaky breaths, and I felt my own chest loosen for the first time since we'd arrived. Chief Walker had done it. No shots fired, no lives lost, just calm, unwavering strength, kind that didn't need to shout or threaten to make itself known. The suspect was cuffed and led away without a struggle, his head bowed, his fight drained out of him. The cashier, a young woman with trembling hands, sank against the counter, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular. Customers emerged from their hiding spots, some dazed, others chattering in low, relieved tones as they processed what they'd just witnessed. The crisis was over, but the night wasn't done with us yet. There'd be reports to file, statements to take, the slow unraveling of the aftermath. As we stepped outside, the cool air hitting my face like a bomb, I caught sight of Riley across the street. He'd been there the whole time, watching from a distance, his lean frame still as stone. His weapon stayed holstered, his hands loose at his sides. He'd trusted Chief Walker, just like I had, and that trust had held firm. I crossed the street toward him, my boots scuffing the pavement. His face was a mask at first, unreadable in the dim streetlight, but then he gave me a small nod, barely a tilt of his head. But enough. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it carried weight. Riley had rough edges, a temper that flared to quick and a stubborn streak a mile wide, but he was changing. I could see it in the way he'd stood back, in the way he'd let Chief Walker lead without question. He was starting to get it. Strength wasn't about flexing muscle or barking orders. It was about knowing when to act, when to listen, when to let someone else take the reins. As we drove back to the precinct, the city lights streaking past in a blur, I felt a quiet pride settle in my chest. It wasn't just Riley who was growing. It was all of USDP by step, choice by choice, learning what Chief Walker had been showing us all along. Back at my desk later, the weight of the day pressed down on me, heavy but not suffocating. It wasn't the big, dramatic moments that defined Houston at the standoffs or the sirens, but the small, quiet ones, the times when we chose patience over rage, understanding over force. Chief Walker wasn't just teaching us how to handle a crisis. She was showing us what justice really meant. It wasn't about punishing every mistake with an iron fist. It was about offering a way out, a chance to step back from the edge. Daniels, with his smirk and his swagger, had wielded power like a club, eager to crush anyone who didn't fit his narrow view. Walker wielded it like a shield, protecting not just the innocent, but the guilty too, giving them a shot at redemption. That was the lesson. Power without restraint was a spark in dry grass, ready to burn everything down. Power with purpose, with humility, could build something better. Riley was still a work in progress, all sharp angles and guarded glances. But he'd taken a step today. So had I, so had we all. Change wasn't loud or fast, it crept in through the cracks, one decision at a time, until you looked back and realized the ground beneath you had shifted. Chief Walker had given us that, and as I stared at the flickering light above my desk, I couldn't help but wonder how many more lessons she had left to teach, and how many we still had to learn. In the midst of chaos, Officer Daniels stood like a towering storm cloud, his presence heavy and unyielding. Rather than stepping aside to let the paramedics work, he rose to his full height, his chest puffed out with an air of command that felt more like intimidation than control. "Hey, back away from the scene," he bellowed at the gathering crowd, his voice a jagged blade slicing through the murmurs of onlookers. It was rough, louder than necessary, echoing off the nearby buildings. Yet, his eyes never wavered from Jackson, the paramedic kneeling beside an injured boy. It was as if Daniels was waiting, hoping for Jackson to falter, to give him an excuse to pounce. The tension between them crackled like static electricity, sharp and dangerous. Jackson exhaled hard through his nose, the breath a deliberate attempt to push down the irritation bubbling inside him. He tried to block out Daniels' looming figure, focusing instead on the boy's shallow breathing, the faint rise and fall of a chest too small for such a burden. But ignoring Daniels wasn't easy. The officer's presence was a weight pressing on Jackson's shoulders, a constant reminder that this encounter was far from over. Daniels wasn't the type to let things slide. He thrived on control, on making others feel small. Jackson could sense it in every sidelong glance the officer threw his way, every muttered remark dripping with disdain. It was suffocating, like a noose tightening with each passing second. As the wail of an approaching ambulance cut through the air, Jackson caught a fleeting glimpse of something in Daniels' expression, a smug superiority laced with a darker edge, something almost predatory. It sent a chill down his spine, but it also sparked a flicker of resolve deep within him. If Daniels wanted to push, Jackson would push back, but on his own terms. The ambulance screeched to a halt, its red and white lights painting the scene in frantic pulses. Jackson waved urgently to his partner, Maria, who leapt from the vehicle with a stretcher in tow. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd seen too many emergencies, her sharp eyes darting between the boy sprawled on the pavement and Daniels, who stood too close for comfort. The air grew thick with unspoken tension, a palpable heaviness that silenced the crowd. Phones were raised like silent sentinels, capturing every moment, every word, as if the onlookers knew they were witnessing the prelude to something explosive. Maria dropped to her knees beside Jackson, her hands steady as she assessed the boy's condition. But her jaw was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. She could feel Daniel's shadow creeping closer, his boots grinding against the gravel with a sound that grated on her nerves. "What's the holdup?" Daniels snapped, his voice cutting through the quiet like a whip. He stepped nearer, his broad frame casting a long, ominous shadow in the glow of the emergency lights. "If you were doing your job right, that kid would already be in the ambulance." His tone was sharp, accusatory, as if he relished the chance to find fault. Jackson didn't look up, his hands moving methodically to secure the straps around the boy's frail body. "We're moving as fast as we can, officer," he replied, his words clipped but measured, a thin veneer of professionalism masking the anger simmering beneath. "Our priority is the patient's safety, not speed." He kept his focus on the child, refusing to give Daniels the reaction he craved. Daniels let out a low, mocking chuckle, the kind that sent a shiver of unease rippling through the crowd. Sure," he muttered under his breath, then raised his voice for all to hear. "Funny how you people always have an excuse." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Maria froze mid-motion, her hands hovering over the stretcher as her head snapped up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a razor's edge, her dark eyes flashing with indignation. Jackson shot her a subtle shake of his head, a silent plea to keep her cool. She bit her lip hard enough to leave a mark, swallowing the retort that burned on her tongue. and returned to helping Jackson lift the boy onto the stretcher. But her movements were stiff, her anger barely contained. As they maneuvered toward the ambulance, Daniels trailed them like a vulture circling prey. His shadow stretched long and menacing, a dark silhouette against the flashing lights. "I'm going to need to see some ID," he said, jabbing a finger at Jackson. "You say you're a paramedic, but how do I know you're not just some guy pretending to be one?" His tone was taunting, a challenge wrapped in suspicion. Jackson stopped, turning to face Daniels fully for the first time, his broad shoulders squared, his calm exterior a fragile mask over the fury churning inside him. He reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness, pulling out his badge and holding it up for the officer to inspect. "Here's my ID," he said, his voice steady but firm, a quiet storm brewing in his words. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a job to do." Daniels barely glanced at the badge before scoffing, his lips curling into a sneer. "Looks fake to me," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Might need to call this in and verify." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the onlookers, some shaking their heads, others clenching their fists. "What's wrong with you, man?" someone shouted from the back. "He's saving a kid's life." But Daniels didn't flinch, his gaze locked on Jackson like a hunter sizing up his target. "I don't take chances," he said with a smirk, his confidence unshaken. "You could be anyone." Jackson took a deep breath, forcing the air into his lungs to steady himself. He knew exactly what Daniels was doing, baiting him, trying to provoke a reaction he could twist to his advantage. But Jackson wasn't going to play that game. "Let's get the boy loaded up," he said to Maria, his voice unwavering despite the fire in his chest. "Every second counts," Maria nodded, her glare at Daniels sharp enough to cut glass as she climbed into the ambulance. Jackson followed, but as he reached for the door, Daniels grabbed his arm, his grip like iron. "Not so fast," the officer said, his voice low and threatening. "I'm not done with you." The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air from the scene. Jackson froze, his muscles tensing under Daniels' hold. Maria leaned out of the ambulance, her face a mask of fury. "Are you kidding me?" she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "Let him go." Daniels ignored her, his eyes boring into Jackson's with a chilling intensity. "You think you can just waltz onto my scene and play hero?" he hissed. "Not on my watch." Jackson looked down at the hand gripping his arm, then met Daniels' gaze with a stare as cold as steel. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but laced with a quiet menace, "if you don't release me right now, you're going to regret it." For a fleeting moment, Daniels hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But then he released Jackson's arm with a sneer, stepping back as if daring him to make the next move. "Watch yourself," he muttered, his bravado a thin shield. Jackson didn't respond. He climbed into the ambulance, his heart hammering against his ribs as Maria slammed the doors shut with a force that echoed in the night. As the vehicle peeled away, the crowd erupted into shouts, their voices a fading chorus of outrage and disbelief. Inside the ambulance, the wail of the siren filled the small space, a relentless sound that matched the pounding in Jackson's chest. Maria turned to him, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and concern. "What the hell was that?" she demanded. He had no right. Jackson's hands moved with practiced precision, stabilizing the boy as he replied, "I know, and he's not getting away with it." Maria frowned, her brow furrowing as she handed him a clipboard with the boy's vitals. "What are you going to do?" Jackson's jaw tightened, his gaze drifting to the window where the flashing lights of the scene faded into the darkness. "Something he'll never forget," he said, his voice a promise wrapped in steel. The ambulance roared through the city streets, its siren a haunting echo against the concrete jungle. Inside, Jackson worked tirelessly, his hands steady as he monitored the boy's condition. But his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Daniel's actions weren't just a personal attack, they were a calculated attempt to strip away his dignity, his professionalism, his very humanity. It was a power play, a reminder of the injustices that festered beneath the surface of authority. And Jackson wasn't going to let it slide. Maria watched him closely, her own anger simmering as she leaned back against the wall of the vehicle. "Vitals are stable for now," she said, her voice softer the adrenaline beginning to ebb. "We'll hand him off to the ER team and follow up later." Jackson nodded, his face unreadable. "But first," he added after a pause, "I need to make a call." Maria raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "You're not letting this go, are you?" Jackson met her gaze, his calm demeanor now edged with resolve. "Would you?" he asked, his tone sharp but not aimed at her. "What he did wasn't just about me, Maria. It was about every person like me who shows up to help, only to be questioned, doubted, or worse." Maria sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly as she nodded. "You're right," she admitted. "But you know how these things go. People like Daniels always find a way to walk away unscathed." Jackson shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "Not this time." When they reached the hospital bay, Jackson and Maria worked in sync to transfer the boy to their team. The boy's mother arrived moments later, her face streaked with tears as she threw her arms around her child, sobbing with relief. Jackson stepped back, letting Maria handle the explanations. He didn't need the spotlight. This job here was done, for now. But as he watched the reunion, a quiet determination settled over him. Justice wasn't just about saving lives. It was about holding those accountable who abused their power. Back at the station, Jackson sat alone in the break room, his phone glowing in his hand. Videos of the confrontation were already spreading online, shared by bystanders who'd captured every humiliating moment. The comments flooded in, some outraged, some supportive, all amplifying the raw emotion of the scene. Maria walked in, to steaming cups of coffee in her hands. She set one down in front of Jackson and leaned against the counter, her expression a mix of exhaustion and defiance. "You're all over social media," she said. "People are furious." Jackson looked up, a faint spark in his eyes. "Good. Maybe it's time people start paying attention." Maria sipped her coffee, watching him carefully. "What's the plan?" Jackson set his phone down and leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "First, I'm filing an official complaint. I've got witnesses, video evidence. Daniels can't squirm out of this one. Second, I'm reaching out to my contacts at the press." Maria's eyes widened. "The press?" Jackson nodded, his voice steady. "This isn't just about one bad cop, Maria. It's about a system that lets people like him thrive. If we don't expose it, nothing changes." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're putting yourself out there. He'll come after you." Jackson's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm ready for that. He wants to intimidate people, make them feel powerless. But I've spent my life proving people like him wrong." Maria's lips curved into a faint smile. "You've got my support, whatever you need." Jackson reached for his coffee, the warmth seeping into his hands as he took a long sip. "Thanks, Maria. I might need all the backup I can get." The silence that followed was broken by the buzz of his phone. A message from Vanessa Grant, a local journalist he'd worked with before. She'd seen the video and wanted to meet. Jackson's lips twitched into a determined smile. "It's starting," he said. Maria tilted her head. "What is the reckoning?" he replied, his voice a quiet thunder. The next morning, Jackson stepped into a bustling coffee shop, the scent of roasted beans mingling with the hum of conversation. Vanessa Grant was already there, seated at a corner table, her laptop open and her phone buzzing incessantly. Known for her fearless reporting on social justice, she had a reputation for turning local stories into national wake-up calls. When she spotted Jackson, she waved him over with a warm but serious smile. "Jackson Cole," she said, standing to shake his hand. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances, but I'm glad you reached out." "Likewise, Vanessa," he replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I couldn't let this go without doing something." Vanessa nodded, her expression hardening. "I've seen the video. It's infuriating, but sadly, not surprising. Power like that gets abused every day. It's just not always caught on camera." Jackson leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "That's why I'm here. Daniels didn't just cross a line. He showed us what happens when authority goes unchecked. It's not just my fight, it's everyone's." Vanessa's eyes gleamed with interest, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "You're ready to take this public?" Jackson met her gaze, unflinching. "I'm ready to make sure he the system that protects him faces the consequences." In that moment, The lesson crystallized for Jackson. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fire that had to be stoked, a battle fought with every ounce of courage. Daniel's abuse of power had lit the match, but Jackson would ensure the flames burned bright enough to illuminate the truth. And as the coffee shop buzzed around them, he felt the weight of his resolve settle into a promise to himself, to Maria, to the boy he'd saved, and to every soul who'd ever been diminished by those who wielded power without conscience. The air in the dimly lit coffee shop hung heavy with the scent of roasted beans and the faint murmur of conversations, but for Jackson, it was as if the world had narrowed to the small table where he sat, his broad shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of the night before, his dark eyes flickering with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. Across from him, Vanessa, a sharp-eyed journalist with a cascade of curly hair spilling over her shoulders, leaned in closer, her notebook open and her pen hovering like a hawk ready to strike. The faint scratch of ink on paper punctuated the silence between them as Jackson's voice, low and steady, began to unravel the tangled threads of the previous night's chaos. "I've had it with people like Daniels," Jackson said, his words carrying the slow burn of a man who'd been pushed too far. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his calloused hands curling into loose fists. "He's one of those cops who thinks the badge gives him a free pass to do whatever he wants. No consequences, no accountability. Well, that's about to change." His tone was firm, but beneath it simmered a quiet fury, a righteous anger born from years of watching arrogance erode the very system he'd sworn to uphold. "He didn't just mess with me. He put a kid's life on the line because he couldn't see past his own pride and prejudice." Vanessa's brow furrowed as she absorbed his words, her pen moving swiftly across the page. She glanced up, her hazel eyes locking onto his with an intensity that matched his own. "Let's go back to the start," she said, her voice calm but insistent, like a guide leading him through the storm of his own memories. "Take me through it, step by step. Don't leave anything out." Jackson exhaled, a slow release of tension, and let his mind drift back to the scene. The night had been cold, the kind of biting chill that seeped into your bones, and the flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance had cast eerie shadows. Across the cracked pavement, he could still hear the boy's shallow, ragged breaths, the faint whimper escaping his lips as Jackson knelt beside him, hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. The child's small frame had been crumpled on the ground, a victim of a hit and run, his dark skin streaked with blood and dirt. Every second had mattered, every movement, every decision, and Jackson had been in his element, barking orders to his partner, Maria, as they worked to stabilize the boy. Then came Daniels. Jackson's jaw tightened at the memory, his fingers twitching as if reliving the moment. The officer had stormed onto the scene, all bluster and bravado, his broad chest puffed out beneath his uniform, his pale face twisted into a scowl. "Step back, I'm handling this," Daniels had barked, his voice dripping with authority he hadn't earned. Jackson hadn't even looked up at first, to focus on the boy's fading pulse. But then he'd felt the rough grip of Daniel's hand clamping onto his arm, yanking him away from the child he was trying to save. The sheer audacity of it had hit Jackson like a punch to the gut, a visceral shock that left him momentarily frozen. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, their murmurs rising into a chorus of confusion and anger as camera phones glinted in the darkness, capturing every second. "That's when it all went sideways," Jackson told Vanessa, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if speaking it aloud might summon the chaos back into being. "I was racing against the clock to keep that kid alive, and Daniels didn't care. He saw a black paramedic and decided I was the problem, not the solution." His eyes darkened, the weight of that truth settling into the lines of his face. "I shoved him off me, told him to back off, and he just doubled down. Started yelling about resisting authority, like I was some criminal instead of a first responder doing my damn job." Vanessa paused her writing, her pen hovering as she let out a slow, deliberate breath. She leaned back in her chair, the wooden frame creaking faintly under her shift and weight, and fixed Jackson with a look that was equal parts disbelief and determination. "This isn't just a bad night," she said, her words measured but sharp. This is a textbook case of racial profiling and abuse of power wrapped into one ugly package. And the fact that it happened while you were literally saving a life, that makes it unforgivable." She tapped her pen against the notebook, a rhythmic tick that betrayed the storm brewing behind her calm exterior. "It's not just about you, either. This is a pattern, isn't it?" Jackson nodded, his gaze drifting to the window where the late morning sun streamed through, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. "You're damn right it's a pattern," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I've heard it from the Athirst paramedics getting second-guessed, firefighters being harassed, even nurses catching hell from cops who think they're above everyone else. It's like some of them forget we're all on the same team, trying to keep people alive. Daniels isn't an outlier. He's a symptom, and I'm done letting it slide." Vanessa's eyes sparked with a fierce resolve, her lips curving into a determined smile. "Then we're going to make sure this gets loud," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "I'll start with a piece for the local paper, but I'm not stopping there. I'll pitch it to the big outlets, national ones. People need to see this for what it is, Jackson. They need to feel it." She scribbled a few more notes, her handwriting a flurry of loops and slashes, when a soft chime interrupted her focus. Her laptop, perched on the edge of the table, lit up with a notification. She clicked it, her eyebrows arching as she read the screen. And then she turned it toward Jackson with a look of incredulous outrage. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her tone laced with bitter amusement. There, in bold letters, was a press release from the police department. "Officer Daniels commended for quick action at emergency scene." Jackson stared at the words, his stomach twisting into a knot of disbelief and disgust. The room seemed to tilt for a moment, the chatter of the coffee shop fading into a dull hum as the absurdity sank in. "Quick action?" he muttered, his voice barely above a growl. "He didn't do a damn thing except get in my way and nearly kill that kid." Vanessa's frown deepened, her fingers tightening around her pen. "They're spinning it," she said, her words clipped with frustration. "Classic damage control, get their version out before the truth can take root. But they're underestimating us." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "That video footage, it's crystal clear. Your testimony seals it. They can't bury this, Jackson. Not when we've got the evidence and the will to fight." Jackson clenched his fists, the muscles in his forearms flexing as he fought to keep his anger in check. He took a deep breath, the air hissing through his teeth, and forced himself to focus. "What's our next move?" he asked, his tone steady despite the fire simmering beneath it. "I'll get the article written today," Vanessa replied, her fingers already itching to hit the keyboard. "We'll push it live on the paper's website and blast it across social media. Once it starts picking up steam, I'll reach out to the bigger players, the Times, whoever will listen. But you need to brace yourself, Jackson. People like Daniels don't go quietly. There'll be backlash." Jackson's lips twitched into a faint, defiant smile. "I've faced worse," he said, his voice carrying the weight of battles fought and won. "And I'm not alone. The crowd that night, they saw everything. They've got my back." He could still picture them, the onlookers with their phones raised, their voices rising in protest as Daniels overstepped. It wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs too. Vanessa reached across the table, her hand resting briefly on his arm, a gesture of solidarity that grounded him. "Good," she said softly. "You're going to need that support. But don't worry, I'll make sure your voice cuts through the noise." Her eyes held his for a moment longer, a silent promise sealed between them. As Jackson stepped out of the coffee shop, the cool March air hit his face like a wake-up call. He squared his shoulders, his boots thudding against the pavement with renewed purpose. Daniels might have thought he could coast on his badge and bluster, but Jackson wasn't about to let him off the hook. The truth was a weapon now, sharp and unyielding, and there was no turning back. By noon, Vanessa's article was live, its headline a blazing accusation that demanded attention. Paramedic harassed by police officer while saving a child's life caught on camera. The words leapt off the screen, bold and unapologetic, and within hours, the story erupted. Local news stations pounced on it first, their anchors reciting the details with furrowed brows and clipped tones. Regional outlets followed, amplifying the outrage, and soon, National platforms were sharing the grainy cell phone footage. Daniel's scowl, Jackson's determined focus, the boy's fragile form at the center of it all. Social media became a wildfire. Hashtags like Justice for Jackson and Andracy Alperfilling blazing across feeds, each post a spark igniting the next. Comments flooded in, a tidal wave of support and fury. This is disgusting, fire that cop. Jackson's a hero, and Daniels should be ashamed. In the cramped break room of the paramedic station, Jackson sat hunched over his phone, the blue glow illuminating his tired features. Maria, his partner from that fateful night, leaned over his shoulder, her dark ponytail swinging as she scrolled through the reactions. Her wide eyes darted across the screen, and she let out a low whistle. "Listen to this one," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "I can't believe this is still happening in 2025. That officer needs to be gone yesterday." She scrolled further, her finger hovering over another comment. "And this, how many more lives will cops like him put at risk? Because their egos matter more than people." She shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "People are pissed, Jackson. And they should be." Jackson set his phone down on the chip formica table, the clatter breaking the hum of the room's ancient coffee maker. He rubbed a hand over his face, the stubble rough against his palm. "It's good they're paying attention," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. "But this is just the start. Daniels and the department will twist this however they can to save face." He glanced at Maria, her arms crossed as she leaned against the counter, her expression a mix of defiance and worry. "They're gonna have a hell of a time trying," she shot back, her tone sharp. "That video's everywhere. No amount of PR spin can erase what people saw with their own eyes." She tapped her foot against the linoleum, a restless rhythm that mirrored the tension in the air. Just then, Jackson's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a notification from the department's internal messaging system. His eyes narrowed as he read it. A mandatory meeting for all emergency responders, scheduled for that afternoon. Maria peeked over his shoulder, her brow furrowing. "They're circling the wagons," she muttered, her voice low. "I'd bet my next paycheck Daniels is sweating bullets right now." Jackson's lips quirked into a faint smirk, a flicker of grim satisfaction breaking through his fatigue. "If he's not, he will be soon," he said, pushing himself to his feet. The fight was far from over, but he was ready to face it head-on. The department's main conference room was a sea of uniforms, that afternoon paramedics in navy polos, firefighters in heavy jackets, and a handful of police officers shifting uncomfortably in their pressed blues. The air was thick with anticipation, the low hum of whispered conversations buzzing like static. Jackson stood near the back, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture rigid but unyielding. Across the room, Officer Daniels loomed near the front, his arms folded tightly, his face a mask of barely contained resentment. His eyes flicked toward Jackson for a fleeting second, a flash of defiance in them. But Jackson held his ground, his gaze steady and unflinching. Chief Montgomery stepped to the front, a towering figure with a weathered face etched by years of hard decisions. His broad shoulders filled out his uniform, and his deep voice cut through the room like a blade as he cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," he began, his tone carrying the weight of authority. "I'm sure you've all heard about the incident last night and the media storm that's followed." The room fell silent, every eye trained on him. "Let me be clear, the safety of our community and the professionalism of our first responders are our top priorities. What happened is under investigation, and we're committed to accountability." Daniels shifted his weight, his scowl deepening, a faint flush creeping up his neck. Maria, standing beside Jackson, leaned in close, her voice a whisper. "Accountability, huh? Let's see if they mean it." Her skepticism hung between them, sharp and unspoken. Montgomery's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Daniels before continuing. "Officer Daniels has given his version of events," he said, his expression unreadable. "But we also have video evidence, witness statements, and the paramedic's testimony. Obstructing an emergency responder is unacceptable. It flies in the face of everything this department stands for." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging wide-eyed glances. Daniel's face reddened, his jaw clenching. But he stayed silent. The chief pressed on, his voice firm. Effective immediately. Officer Daniels is on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome. The room erupted into a low roar of whispered relief from some, disbelief from others. Maria nudged Jackson with her elbow, a grin tugging at her lips. "Step one," she murmured. Jackson's face remained stoic, but inside, a small ember of satisfaction flared. It wasn't justice or not yet, but it was a crack in the wall Daniels had built around himself. As the meeting dispersed, Montgomery approached Jackson, his heavy footsteps echoing in the now quiet room. "Mr. Cole," he said, his tone softer but no less commanding, "I'd like a word in my office." Jackson nodded, his jaw tightening as he followed the chief down the hall. The office was sparse but imposing, a mahogany desk dominating the space, its surface cluttered with reports and a flickering computer screen. Montgomery gestured for Jackson to sit, then leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "I've seen the footage and read the reports," he said, his gray eyes locking onto Jackson's. "I owe you an apology for what you went through. It was wrong, plain and simple." Jackson met his gaze, unflinching. "An apology is a start, Chief," he said, his voice low but resolute, "but it doesn't fix it." Daniels didn't just disrespect May, endangered a kid's life and chipped away at the trust between our teams and the people we serve. His words hung heavy in the air. A challenge and a plea rolled into one. Montgomery nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly, as if the weight of Jackson's truth pressed down on him. "You're right," he admitted. "That's why I'm pushing for mandatory bias training for all officers, starting now. And we're reviewing our policies to make sure this doesn't happen again." His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of weariness in it. A man wrestling with a system larger than himself. Jackson's expression softened, but only just. "I appreciate that, Chief," he said. "But this isn't just about me. It's about changing a culture that lets people like Daniels think they can act without consequence. Justice isn't a one-off, it's a reckoning." Montgomery sighed, a rare crack in his stoic facade. "You're not wrong, Cole, but change takes time." "Time's up," Jackson replied, his voice firm as steel. "The community's watching. I'm watching." He stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and left the office with a fire in his chest. This wasn't the end, it was the spark. In the days that followed, the story swelled into a national tempest. News channels looped the video relentlessly, pundits clashing over its meaning, some decrying Daniels' actions as a symptom of deeper rot, others scrambling to defend him as a misunderstood cog in the machine. Jackson became an unwilling fulcrum, the eye of a storm he hadn't sought. At the station, the air buzzed with quiet support colleagues pausing their chatter to clap him on the shoulder. A rookie paramedic with wide eyes calling him a hero over lukewarm coffee. "You kept your cool," the kid said, awe in his voice. "I'd have lost it." Jackson managed a tired smile, stirring his coffee with a plastic spoon. "It's not about me," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's about making sure no one else has to deal with this crap." Maria joined him at the counter, her brow creased as she scrolled through her phone. "You see the department's latest statement?" she asked, holding up the screen. Another press release, another attempt to smooth the edges of a jagged truth. Jackson nodded, his eyes tracing the words. The fight was far from over, but the lesson was clear. Power unchecked was a poison, and justice set through justice was the antidote. Daniels had gambled on silence and impunity, but the tide had turned. The truth was out, and it wouldn't be buried again. The department had put out yet another carefully worded press release, this time admitting to Officer Daniels' suspension, while unveiling plans for mandatory bias training across the force. The statement dripped with polished phrases about their dedication to fostering better community ties, but it danced around any real admission of guilt, leaving a hollow echo where accountability should have been. Maria, leaning against the counter in the break room, crumpled the paper in her hand and let out a bitter scoff. "They're just tossing out a few promises, hoping this blows over," she said, her voice thick with frustration as she shook her head. "They think they can wait out the storm, like always." Jackson, standing nearby with his arms crossed, met her gaze with a steely resolve. "Not this time," he replied, his tone low but unshakable. "This isn't dying down, not now." That night, Jackson sat alone at his weathered kitchen table, the dim glow of his laptop casting shadows across his tired face. His inbox was overflowing with messagesm from strangers thanking him for raising his voice, others from colleagues offering quiet support. But one email stopped him cold. It was from Adri Harris, a local community organizer whose name carried weight in the neighborhood. DeAndre's words were direct, yet warm, inviting Jackson to speak at a town hall later that week about systemic racism and first response and law enforcement. Jackson's finger hovered over the screen, his chest tightening. He wasn't a public speaker. His life was about rushing into chaos to save people, not standing under a spotlight to address a crowd. Yet, as he reread the message, a flood of memories surged up. All the times he'd bitten his tongue, stayed quiet, and waited for someone else to take a stand. Each silent moment now felt like a weight pressing down on him. This time, he knew he couldn't turn away. The town hall took place in a cavernous auditorium, its wooden floors creaking under the press of a standing room-only crowd. The air buzzed with anticipation as a diverse mix of people filled the space. Paramedics in faded jackets, firefighters with calloused hands, nurses still in scrubs, police officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, alongside community leaders and everyday citizens clutching handwritten signs. At the front, a long table stretched across the stage, where Jackson sat beside Adri and a handful of other panelists, including a retired police chief, whose weathered face told stories of a career spent wrestling with the system he'd once upheld. Adri kicked things off, his voice booming through the room like a thunderclap, igniting the audience with a passionate call for accountability and a vision of a system rebuilt from the ground up. When it was Jackson's turn, a hush fell over the crowd, so thick he could hear his own heartbeat. He rose slowly, his hands gripping the podium's edges as if anchoring himself against the tide of eyes fixed on him. For a moment, he let his gaze sweep over the sea of face, some weary, some angry, some hopeful. Before he spoke, "My name's Jackson Cole, and I'm a paramedic," he began, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fire. "For years, I've run toward danger, toward people in their worst moments. No matter who they are or where they come from, that's who I am. But last week, while I was fighting to save a kid's life, I was treated like a threat, like a criminologist, because of the color of my skin." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, a mix of shock and recognition, but Jackson pressed forward, his words gaining strength. "What happened to me wasn't some fluke. It's a symptom of something bigger, a culture that lets people like Officer Daniels wield power without consequence, while people like me have to keep proving we deserve to be here. This isn't just my story, it's the story of every black paramedic, firefighter, nurse, or doctor who's had their worth questioned because of someone else's bias." The murmurs swelled, a chorus of anger and solidarity rising from the crowd. Jackson lifted a hand, calling for quiet, his eyes blazing with purpose. "I'm not here to just throw blame around and walk away. I'm here because change has to start somewhere. It starts with owning up to the damage done by people like Danielle Snit, with half measures like bias training, but with real, root-deep reform." The room exploded into applause, a wave of sound that crashed over him as he stepped back, his pulse racing. He didn't know if his words would shift the world, but they were his truth, raw and unfiltered, and that was enough for now. Afterward, people lined up to approach him, their faces a gallery of emotions: gratitude, pain, resolve. A young firefighter, barely out of his 20s, shuffled forward, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've seen stuff like this happen before too many times. I never said anything. Thought it wasn't my fight. But after what you went through, after hearing you tonight, I want to do better. I want to help fix this." Jackson studied the man's earnest eyes, then clasped his shoulder firmly. "It's never too late to step up," he said, a faint smile breaking through his fatigue. "We need every voice we can get." As he left the auditorium that night, the cool air hitting his face, Jackson felt a burden lift, not entirely, but enough to lighten his steps. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, but for the first time in ages, a flicker of hope burned steady in his chest. He wasn't alone in this anymore. The next morning, Jackson woke to a flood of new messages lighting up his phone. Some came from fellow paramedics and firefighters, their words heavy with shared stories of racial profiling and quiet indignities endured on the job. Others were from activists and community organizers, pledging their support and urging him to keep pushing. But the ones that hit hardest were from inside the police department itself. One officer wrote, "I'm a cop, and what Daniels did makes me sick. Not all of us are like that. I want to help set things right." Another confessed, "I've stayed quiet too long about what I've seen here. Your courage is giving me mine." Jackson sat at his table, coffee growing cold as he read each one, the weight of their words sinking in. What started as a single clash with Daniels had spiraled into something vast, a movement he hadn't meant to lead but couldn't turn away from. The bigger it grew, the more it fueled his determination. Meanwhile, Daniels wasn't fading into the shadows. A local news station aired an exclusive interview with him, his face taut with defiance as he sat under the studio lights. "I was just doing my job," he insisted, his voice sharp and clipped, barely masking his indignation. "It's a shame people have twisted this to paint me as the villain. Anyone who knows me knows I'm not a racist." Jackson watched the broadcast with Maria at the station, her hands flying up in exasperation. "Unbelievable," she snapped, pacing the room. "He's digging in instead of owning it." Jackson's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Let him talk. The truth doesn't need his permission to stand." And it didn't. Video evidence and witness accounts had already carved a chasm between Daniel's story and reality. Online, outrage flared anew, hashtags demanding his firing trending alongside clips of the incident. Even some of his fellow officers began to pull away, their silence louder than any statement. Then came the second blow. Another video, this one older, surfaced online. It showed Daniels looming over a black teenager during a traffic stop, his tone dripping with aggression as he berated the boy for no clear reason. The footage was a match struck in dry grass, reigniting public fury and piling pressure on the department. Jackson, meanwhile, threw himself into the fight. He teamed up with Vanessa Grant, a fierce activist whose sharp mind and unyielding spirit made her a force to be reckoned with. Together, they planned a rally outside the police station, a call for oversight and sweeping change. On the day of the event, hundreds gathered under a gray sky, their signs bobbing above the crowd. "Justice for Jackson. Protect first responders. Fire Daniels now." The diversity of the face, black, white, young, old, uniformed, and civilian, painted a vivid picture of unity. Jackson took the makeshift stage, microphone trembling slightly in his grip as he looked out at the throng. Emotion surged through him, a mix of gratitude and resolve, and he drew a deep breath before speaking. "We're here today because what happened to me wasn't a one-off," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "It's a thread in a tapestry of discrimination and abuse that's been tolerated for too long. But we're also here because we believe in something better, because we know change isn't just a dream. It's a necessity." The crowd roared, and he pushed on, his words rising with their energy. "This isn't about one officer or one department. It's about building a system where dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right. Where accountability isn't a buzzword, it's a promise kept. We're not here for handouts, we're here for fairness, and we're not stopping until it's real." Cheers shook the air, and Jackson stepped back, his chest heaving with hope and exhaustion. The fight stretched far ahead, but moments like this were fuel for the fire. Back at the station, the walls were closing in on Daniels. His suspension had morphed into a full investigation, the new video tightening the noose. Chief Montgomery, a man who'd spent years mastering the art of containment, now faced a reckoning he couldn't sidestep. The department was fracturing. Some officers condemned Daniels openly, their voices carrying the weight of years of frustration, while others rallied to his defense, their loyalty a stubborn shield. The tension seeped into every corner, from hushed arguments in the locker room to sit-along glances in the halls. That night, as Jackson brushed his teeth and prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a new text. It was from Montgomery. "Mr. Cole, I'd like to meet tomorrow. We need to talk next steps. Time to face this head-on." Jackson stared at the screen, his toothbrush still in hand, then typed back, "I'll be there." He set the phone down and sank into his chair, exhaling slowly. The gears of justice were grinding forward, but tomorrow would be a battle. He was walking into the heart of the bestial's domain, Montgomery's turf, but he was ready. They'd underestimated him once. They wouldn't get a second chance. Morning broke with a sharp edge. The sky streaked with clouds as Jackson strode into the police station. The air inside crackled with uneasy. Officers darted through the corridors, some offering quick nods of respect, others averting their eyes as if he carried a storm in his wake. He squared his shoulders, feeling the weight of every step, every glance. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a confrontation with a system that had shielded men like Daniels for too long. Justice, he thought, wasn't a gift, it was a demand, and he was here to make it heard. The air in the room felt thick with tension as Jackson Cole stepped inside, his boots echoing faintly on the polished floor of the police department's conference room. He wasn't alone in this moment. Standing alongside him were a handful of senior officers, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and members of the Internal Review Board, their faces etched with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Vanessa Grant, a fierce advocate with a fire in her eyes, had insisted on being there, her presence a quiet but unshakable pillar of support. Beside her stood Adri Harris, the community organizer whose voice had rallied countless others to this cause, his steady gaze reflecting a resolve that seemed to anchor the room. Their companionship wrapped around Jackson like a lifeline, easing the knot of uncertainty twisting in his gut. He wasn't facing this battle solo, and that thought steadied his racing heart. Chief Montgomery rose from his seat as Jackson approached, extending a hand with a measured but genuine warmth. "Mr. Cole, thank you for coming," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority tempered by a hint of weariness. Jackson gripped the offered hand firmly, his own calloused palm pressing against Montgomery's with purpose. "I'm here because this can't wait any longer, Chief," he replied, his tone sharp and unwavering. "No more stalling, no more excuses." Montgomery gave a slow nod, his gray eyes meeting Jackson's with a flicker of understanding, and motioned for everyone to settle into the stiff-backed chairs circling the long table. "I agree," he said simply. "Let's dive in." The meeting kicked off with a heavy silence as they turned to the incident that had brought them all together. A large screen flickered to life, casting stark light across the room, and the video began to play. The audio crackled through the speakers, filling the space with Daniel's smug, mocking voice, each word dripping with arrogance as he dismissed the very people he was sworn to protect. Jackson's stomach churned as he watched, the scene unfolding like a wound reopened. He'd seen it before too many times, but the rawness of it still hit him hard. His eyes darted around the table, catching the reactions of those seated there. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their jaws tight, their hands fidgeting with pens or papers as if trying to distance themselves from the footage. Others stared ahead, their expressions carved from stone, betraying nothing. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line, her brow furrowing with a mix of anger and vindication, while Adri sat still, his head tilted slightly, absorbing every second with a quiet intensity. When the video finally cut to black, a heavy pause hung in the air until Montgomery cleared his throat, the sound rough and deliberate. "We've all witnessed what happened," he began, his voice steady but firm. "And I think it's clear that Officer Daniels' actions were beyond the pale. That's why, effective today, he's no longer part of this department." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of reaction across the room. Vanessa's eyebrows shot up, a spark of surprise lighting her dark eyes, while Adri gave a slow, approving nod, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. Jackson felt a faint wave of relief wash over him, a loosening of the tension that had coiled in his chest for weeks, but it wasn't enough yet. Daniel's dismissal was a bandage, not a cure, and the deeper rot still festered beneath the surface. Montgomery pressed on, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "But this isn't just about one officer. What we've seen here shines a light on bigger problems, systemic issues we can't keep brushing aside. Starting now, we're rolling out mandatory bias training for every officer on this force. On top of that, I'm putting together a task force to dig into our policies and procedures, to figure out where we've gone wrong and how we fix it." His words carried a note of determination, but Jackson wasn't ready to let it rest there. He leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the table, his voice cutting through the murmurs that followed. "That's a step, Chief, but it's not the whole journey. Training's a good start, nobody's arguing that, but it won't uproot a culture that lets someone like Daniel thrive. You need accountability, real systems to catch people like him before they hurt anyone else." Montgomery's gaze locked onto Jackson's, a flicker of challenge in his eyes. But he didn't interrupt. What are you suggesting?" he asked, his tone even but probing. Jackson glanced at Vanessa, who gave him a small, encouraging nod, her faith in him a silent push forward. He took a breath, then let his conviction spill out. First, independent oversight, a civilian review board with the power to investigate complaints and hold officers accountable. Second, regular evaluations of how officers behave, not just with the public, but with firefighters, paramedics, everyone they cross paths with. Third, consequences that stick, punishments that aren't just threats on paper, but actually happen when someone steps out of line. His words hung in the air, bold and unyielding. A blueprint born from too many nights spent replaying Daniel's cruelty in his mind. One of the senior officers, a grizzled man with a chest full of commendations, bristled, his face reddening as he leaned forward. "That sounds like you're saying we can't police ourselves," he snapped, his voice gravelly with indignation. Jackson didn't flinch, meeting the man's glare head-on. "With all due respect, trust isn't something you get by default, it's something you earn. Right now, the community doesn't trust you. Actions like Daniel's don't just hurt people like Methy, drag your whole department through the mud." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a storm cloud. Montgomery leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable but thoughtful. "You're pushing for big shifts, Mr. Cole," he said at last, his voice low. "I'm pushing for what's right," Jackson shot back, his chest tight with a mix of frustration and hope. "If you're serious about earning back trust, you'll make those changes. If not, this department's going to stay broken and everyone will see it." DeAndre's voice cut through the stillness, steady and resonant. "The community's got its eyes on you, Chief. This is your shot to prove you're a leader, not just a figurehead. Don't let it slip away." Montgomery's gaze swept the table, lingering on the senior officer, some nodding faintly, others staring down at their hands before returning to Jackson. "You've made your case, and it's a strong one," he said finally. "I'll take these ideas to the city council, but I'll need your help, Mr. Cole. If we're going to pull this off, we need people like you to steer us." Jackson nodded, his jaw set. "I'm in, but let's be clear. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for every first responder who's been spat on, every person in this community who's been kicked down, and every life that's been endangered because of bias." Montgomery extended his hand again, and Jackson took it, their grip firm and resolute. A flicker of hope stirred in him, mingling with the fire of determination that had carried him this far. The fight was far from over, but this felt like a turning point, a crack in the wall that might just let the light of change seep through. As he stepped out of the building, Vanessa and Adri fell into step beside him, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Vanessa's face broke into a wide grin, her eyes sparkling with pride. "That was incredible, Jackson. You're not just rewriting the story, you're tearing down the whole damn system and building something new." Adri clapped him on the shoulder, his touch solid and grounding. "This is how it begins, man. You've got people's attention now, that's half the war won." Jackson tilted his head back, gazing up at the endless stretch of blue sky above. The burden of the past week still pressed against his ribs, but it felt lighter somehow, less suffocating. "It's not just me," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's all of us." He knew the road ahead would be grueling, but for the first time, he could see a glimmer of possibility on the horizon. The weeks that followed were a chaotic blur of progress, resistance, and sheer stubborn will. True to his word, Chief Montgomery took Jackson's proposals to the city council, laying them out in a packed chamber where the air buzzed with tension. It wasn't a smooth ride. Some officers pushed back hard, their voices rising in heated debates, while a few council members scoffed, dismissing the reforms as overreach or pandering. But the public wouldn't let it die. Protests swelled outside the department, A sea of signs and voices demanding justice, their chants echoing through the streets. Rallies drew cameras and headlines, and Daniel's video kept spreading online, igniting conversations that stretched far beyond the city limits. Jackson found himself thrust into a role he'd never sought, not just a paramedic stitching up wounds, but a reluctant leader stitching together a movement. He stood at city council podiums, his hands gripping the wood as he spoke from the heart, his words raw and unpolished but piercing. He sat in community forums, listening to tearful stories from neighbors and nodding as they poured out their fears and hopes. He teamed up with local groups, hashing out plans late into the night to keep the pressure on. The days stretched long, and the weight of it all pressed down on him. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every face, every doubt. But he kept going, driven by a truth bigger than himself. This wasn't about his own pain. It was about forging a world where no paramedic, firefighter, or citizen had to endure what he had. One quiet evening, as he sat slumped over a cup of cold coffee, his phone buzzed with a message that stopped him cold. It was from a young paramedic halfway across the country. Her words trembling across the screen. "I saw what you did, and it gave me the guts to speak up about what's happened to me. Thank you for standing till you've lit a fire in so many of us." Jackson stared at the text, his throat tightening, his chest aching with something he couldn't name. He hadn't meant to become a beacon, but the responsibility settled over him like a mantle he couldn't shake off. If his voice could lift others out of the shadows, then every sleepless night, every hard-fought word was worth it. But the fight wasn't clean or simple. Daniel refused to fade quietly into the background. He'd filed an appeal to claw his job back, spinning a tale of victimhood, claiming he'd been scapegoated in a witch hunt. A small knot of supporters rallied around him, loud, brash voices shouting that he'd been wronged, their signs clashing with the tidal wave of justice seekers. Their protests were a faint echo compared to the roaring crowds demanding change. But they gnawed at Jackson, a reminder that the battle lines were still drawn. Vanessa called him one night, her voice crackling with urgency over the line. "Daniel's digging in," she said, frustration lacing her words. "He's trying to paint this as an assault on every cop out there." Jackson leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes, his jaw clenching. "It's not about attacking cops, it's about rooting out racism and power trips. There's a world of difference." "Exactly," Vanessa replied, her tone softening but still sharp. "But you know how people twist things. That's why we can't let up, keep talking, keep showing what's really on the line." He sighed, the weariness seeping into his bones. "I just wish it didn't feel like a war every damn day. Shouldn't we all want the same thing? Fairness, safety, accountability?" "We should," she said, her voice gentling. "But until we're there, folks like you have to keep carrying the torch." The city council finally voted, and to Jackson's stunned relief, the reforms passed with every hand raised in favor. A civilian review board would rise, independent and unflinching. Bias training would drill into every officer annually. Misconduct would face real, enforceable consequences. It wasn't flawless, nothing ever was, but it was a leap forward, a foundation to build on. The city erupted in celebration, and that night, Jackson stood in a packed park at a rally, surrounded by faceless activists, neighbors, fellow first responders who'd walked this road with him. The air hummed with energy, the crowd's cheers washing over him as he took the stage. "I'm proud of what we've done," he said into the microphone, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "But let's not kid ourselves, this is just the start. Change doesn't come easy or fast. It comes when we keep showing up, keep calling out what's wrong, and keep demanding better. So let's do that together." The crowd roared, a wave of sound that shook the ground beneath his feet, and he stepped back, a rare smile breaking through the exhaustion. As the throng thinned out, Maria, paramedic who'd been in his corner from the jump, found him sitting on a bench, staring out at the city's twinkling lights. She dropped down beside him, nudging his shoulder with hers and handing him a bottle of water, the plastic cool against his palm. "You pulled it off," she said, her voice warm with quiet awe. "You actually did it." Jackson chuckled, the sound rough but genuine. "We did it," he corrected, twisting the cap off the bottle. "This wouldn't have happened without all of you." Maria smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Still, you're the one who lit the match." He took a long sip, the water soothing his dry throat, and let his gaze drift back to the skyline. The lesson here wasn't just about justice, it was about what happened when power went unchecked, when arrogance poisoned duty. Daniel's fall was a warning, a crack in the armor of a system that had shielded him too long. And Jackson, he was ready to keep hammering at those cracks until something real, something lasting, broke through. Jackson Cole stood tall, his broad shoulders squared as he faced the crowd that day, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his chest. He could still feel the tremble in his hands, the way his voice had wavered at first before steadying into something firm and resolute. He'd been the one to rise first, the one who couldn't let the injustice fester any longer. And now, as he sat across from Maria in the dim glow of her living room, he traced the edges of that memory with a thoughtful gaze. "You know," he said, his voice low and textured with reflection, "I think it hit me that if I stayed quiet, if I let it slide, nothing would ever shift. And if nothing shifts, what kind of world are we handing over to the kids coming up behind us?" His brow furrowed, a flicker of worry crossing his face, not for himself, but for the future he felt responsible for shaping. Maria leaned forward, her dark eyes catching the soft light as she tilted her head, studying him with that quiet intensity she always carried. "You're not just a paramedic anymore, Jackson," she said, her words deliberate, sinking into the air between them. "You've stepped into something bigger. People are watching you now, leaning on you. You're a leader, whether you meant to be or not." Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, but there was a weight to her observation, an unspoken challenge. Jackson let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck as a nervous laugh escaped him. "That's a lot to take in, you know. Intimidating as hell, if I'm honest." His hazel eyes flicked up to meet hers, searching for reassurance, though he'd never admit it outright. The idea of being a figurehead, a beacon for others, sat uneasily on his shoulder. Had always been more comfortable in the chaos of an emergency call than in the spotlight of expectation. "Maybe it is," Maria replied, her tone softening but still firm. "But if there's anyone who can carry that weight, it's you. I've seen you keep your cool when everyone else is losing theirs. You've got it in you, Jackson." She settled back into the worn cushions of her couch, and for a moment they let the silence stretch between them, comfortable, familiar quiet that felt like a balm after the storm they'd weathered together. In that stillness, Jackson felt a peace settle over him, a rare calm that had eluded him for weeks. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he could sense the ground shifting beneath them, moving toward something better. It wasn't just a fleeting hope, it was a tangible promise, and that alone made every sleepless night, every heated argument, worth it. As the weeks stretched into months, the seeds of change they'd planted began to take root, sprouting into something real. The Civilian Review Board came to life, a patchwork of voiceless community organizers with fire in their eyes, legal scholars with sharp minds, and activists who'd spent years shouting into the void. It wasn't flawless, no system born from human hands ever could be, but it was a beginning, a fragile yet defiant step toward accountability, and it lit a spark of hope in people who'd long felt unheard. For Jackson, life started to weave itself back into a rhythm he recognized. He was back on the ambulance, the familiar wail of sirens filling his ears as he raced through the city streets, hands steady as he worked to save lives. It was what he loved most, being there in the raw, unfiltered moments when someone's world hung in the balance, offering them a lifeline. But things weren't the same anymore, not really. He wasn't just the guy in the uniform stitching wounds and restarting hearts. He'd become something more, a symbol of what it meant to stand up, to push back against the tide of corruption and apathy. Everywhere he went, people noticed. A shopkeeper would pause to grip his hand with a murmured thank you. A mother would catch his eye across a crowded street and nod in quiet gratitude. Or a stranger would stop him mid-stride to pour out their own tales of hardship and hard-won victories. Each encounter left him humbled, a little overwhelmed, but undeniably proud. One chilly evening, the radio crackled with a call that sent him speeding toward a quiet neighborhood, the kind where porch lights glowed warmly against the encroaching dusk. A man had collapsed in his driveway, and when Jackson arrived, He found an elderly figure slumped against the cold concrete, one frail hand pressed to his chest. The man's breaths came in shallow gasps, his weathered face tight with pain, but his eyes still sharp, clinging to consciousness. Jackson dropped to his knees beside him, the gravel biting into his skin through his pants as he leaned in close. "Hey there, sir," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos, soft but unwavering. "You're gonna be just fine, all right? We're gonna get you to the hospital, and they'll fix you up good as new." His hands moved with practiced ease, checking vitals, offering comfort, his calm demeanor a shield against the man's rising panic. As he worked, the faint hum of an engine caught his ear, and he glanced up to see a police cruiser rolling to a stop nearby. His stomach tightened instinctively, a reflex carved deep from months of tension and distrust. He braced himself, half expecting to see Officer Daniels's smug grin and heavy-handed arrogancy or someone cut from the same cloth. But instead, a young woman stepped out, her uniform pristine, her posture relaxed yet attentive. She couldn't have been more than a few years out of the academy, her face open and kind, devoid of the cynicism that often came with the badge. "Need any help here?" she called, her voice carrying a sincerity that cut through the crisp air. Jackson nodded, grateful for the offer. "Yeah, could you keep the area clear while we load him up?" He gestured toward the small knot of neighbors who'd begun to gather, their murmurs of concern rippling through the evening quiet. "Of course," she replied without hesitation, turning to the crowd with a gentle authority. "Folks, please step back and give them room to work. They've got this under control." Her words were firm but warm, and the onlookers complied, shuffling back with nods of understanding. It was a fleeting exchange, nothing more than a few minutes of coordination, but to Jackson, it felt like a revelation. This was how it was supposed to be: simple, professional, grounded in mutual respect. No power trips, no threats, just two people doing their jobs, serving the same community. As he and his partner hoisted the stretcher into the ambulance, the officer approached him again, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. "Thank you for what you do," she said, her eyes meeting his with a quiet earnestness that caught him off guard. He flashed a tired but genuine smile. "Same to you." The words hung there, small but loaded with meaning. It was a tiny moment in the grand scheme of things, but to Jackson, it was everything: a glimmer of proof that the world could change, that people could grow, that justice didn't have to be a distant dream. Later that night, as he drove home through the city's winding streets, the weight of the past year settled over him like a heavy coat. He thought about that night with Daniels shouting, the adrenaline, the sickening realization that power could twist even those sworn to protect. He thought about the battles that followed, the endless meetings and protests, the nights he'd lain awake doubting whether any of it mattered. But then there were the Victoriasti board, the reforms, the slow thaw of a system that had felt frozen in place. They'd all led him here, to this quiet drive under a sky streaked with stars, where he could finally believe they were heading somewhere better. When he pulled into his driveway, his phone buzzed against the console, the screen lighting up with a notification. It was an article from Vanessa Grant, the journalist who'd been there from the start, chronicling their fight with a pen as sharp as any sword. Her latest piece glowed on the screen. One voice sparked a movement. How a paramedic's courage changed a community. Jackson leaned back in his seat, a slow smile spreading across his face as he skimmed the words. He didn't feel like a hero. Heroes were flawless, larger-than-life figures, and he was just a man who'd refused to look the other way. But knowing he'd lit a match that others had carried forward, knowing he'd helped tip the scales toward justice, filled him with a quiet pride that warmed him from the inside out. He switched off his phone and stepped out into the night, the cool air brushing against his skin like a whisper of encouragement. Tilting his head back, he gazed up at the vast expanse of stars twinkling above, each one a tiny testament to persistence. The fight wasn't over. It never would be, not really. Corruption and abuse of power were stubborn weeds, always creeping back when you least expected. But Jackson felt ready for the road ahead, bolstered by the lesson etched into every step of this journey. Justice wasn't a gift handed down from on high. It was a garden cultivated through courage, through consequences that humbled the mighty and lifted the voiceless. And he, Jackson Cole, had proven that even one voice trembling Determined voice gold shake the earth and plant the seeds for something enduring.